1 minute.
You're listening to Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
Live from across the divided states of America, it is now time for another edition of the most disruptive show covering news, events, politics, and more from across these disunited states and the increasingly divided surface of our globe. In the independent corner, I am your political analyst, Shane Stranahan.
And in the left corner, I am the indefatigable, a burning emperor in the darkness, your political analyst, Jamarl Thomas.
And together we are Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. All right. Good morning, everybody. I hope you are having a wonderful morning indeed. I want to give folks a quick rundown in anticipation of today's show. We're going to be talking about the COVID situation later this hour with Peter Oliver from 7:30 to 8 a.m. Eastern, talking specifically about Germany, how they're dealing with it, some problems they're facing as COVID seems to be abating. Then in the 8 o'clock hour from 8:15 to 8:45, we're going to be talking with Steve Bassett about his expectations on a congressional report on UFOs, talking about UFOs basically, also the Inspector General for the Pentagon looking into the DoD's work on this stuff. Then at 8:45 a.m. Eastern this morning, we're going to be speaking with Camila Escalante about the ongoing sizable protests in Colombia, which we have scarcely heard about here in the United States, mainly because they're ostensibly an ally of ours. And so, unlike when there are protests in Venezuela, for instance, we tend not to hear about them, and the ones in Venezuela we would hear about all the time. It would be like you said the other day, Jamarl, there would be open talk of like invading that country.
Yeah, I mean, if
there was stuff ongoing there.
If Maduro put tanks on the ground, took a city, had multiple people killed and everything, yeah, they would be screaming about, hey, we need to invade Venezuela, we need to take over Venezuela, Maduro's killing his people. That would be the language. We haven't heard anything about Colombia. Those protests have been massive, basically invisible.
They have been muted. Yeah, no, and in the Western press, they've been muted too. Then in the 9 o'clock hour, from 9:15 to 9:45, we're planning on speaking with Mark Frost about the U.S. housing market, which is going gangbusters through the roof, might be in a bubble, all that stuff right now. Then we're also going to be talking about the role of reserve currencies. These are both conversations that we've been having over the last week or so on the show, whether it's between Jamarl and I or folks calling in with interesting comments on the housing market, wanting to talk about it. So we wanted to go to an economist. We will be speaking with Mark Frost, one of our resident economists for Fault Lines, I suppose, between 9:15 and 9:45 later on this morning. Anyway, without further ado, I want to get to our headlines here. First up in COVID news, there were at least 40,531 new COVID cases reported in the United States yesterday, with 890 new deaths. Over the past week, there has been an average of 48,000 cases per day. That's a decrease of 26% from the average 2 weeks earlier. And as of right now, 32% of the American public has been fully vaccinated, and 45% of residents have received at least one dose. As of this morning, the coronavirus has infected more than 32,539,178 people across the United States and killed about 578,010 people. This comes after yesterday, President Biden set the goal of at least partially vaccinating 70% of adult Americans by July 4th, saying that his administration is going to make it, quote, easier than ever to get vaccinated, end quote. So far, about 145 million adults. That's 56% of the adult population, which, and when we give the population stats in the morning, when I put this stuff down, that's total population. Anyway, 32% of the total American public has been fully vaccinated. 45% of the total American public has received at least one dose, but 56% of the adult public has received at least one dose. There are children in our society too, and they will drive those numbers down. Anyway, the aim is to have 70%, that specific threshold passed about 2 months from today. This comes as in the last few weeks, almost 1 million adults have been added to that total for each day. Although, by the way, the total rate of vaccinations has actually slowed since it reached its peak 3 weeks ago. And it could continue to slow, even further if we try for this sort of July 4th 70% goal. We are most of the way there by far. We're 56% out of 70%. So it seems like the whole vaccine push, and I don't know how else to put it, has been a relative success. It doesn't seem to have, I don't know, maybe you've heard other stories, Jamarl. It doesn't seem to have the actual vaccine thing doesn't seem to have radically interfered with or changed our society. I'm not hearing about like large-scale behavioral changes that it seems a lot of people were worried about. I just remember a crap ton of fear-mongering. Do you know what I'm talking about? At this point, most adults in the United States have gotten at least one vaccine. And I guess we'll see. But I remember a lot of people being extremely worried about the consequences of getting the coronavirus vaccine. What's your take?
No,
you must have seen this too.
My take is right. The fear-mongering of this, I can't stand. Tucker Carlson has been fear-mongering on this, for example. And I don't know if it's a grift. I don't know if he put his finger into the wind and you see, Republican white males being the demographic least likely to get it. I don't know, but I am greatly aggravated with this notion of attacking the vaccine or fear-mongering around the vaccine when nearly 600,000 Americans have died over in the course of a year. Like taking a position that is going to make that number worse is not something that I prize. And so, no, I agree with you on this. The vaccine rollout has been successful. I mean, I don't know what else you call it. We had 5,000 people a day dying a day. It wasn't because they were wearing masks. It wasn't because they were in the house and stayed in the house. Those numbers didn't abate when people were supposedly doing that. The numbers started to abate when people started getting the vaccine. So I would say, yeah, I think the vaccine rollout in this country has been a success. Full stop.
I think so too. Part of it, there was like a rolling thing that was happening when lockdowns were lifted and then when they were reimposed. I remember that happening in multiple states. But what seems to be really doing, and then we went into cold and flu season, which just, I've heard a couple of different sort of competing explanations for what exactly cold and flu season is. In other words, what about that time of the year, like whether it's weather patterns or behavior patterns or just climatic conditions, those kinds of things. What causes people to be more likely to get the cold and flu? The one that makes the most sense to me is people being indoors in close quarters a lot more together than they would in summer. But I've heard other people say that that's not fully accurate. Anyway, that hit, cold and flu season hit. A lot of people started to circulate COVID. The numbers went up. And so whether you were in lockdown or not, it just seemed a lot more likely for people to get it. And of course, that was when we saw our largest wave yet in the United States. And now vaccines seem to be doing the trick. Now, in terms of long COVID, and I actually sort of two definitions of long COVID. One is the symptoms that you get after contracting COVID over the course of months or years that you'll experience, but then also just the future course of this disease itself, the sort of fate of the pandemic as a whole. Going into next cold and flu season, which isn't that many months from now when that's going to be starting, it's just, of course, later this year, I am curious to see how we do. I'm curious to see if at that point, I think if we can make it through that, this is a sort of speculation, but if we can make it through this next cold and flu season with cases being pretty darn low, I think the pandemic will be over at that point. I think unless something unprecedented happens before that, with it either going way back up or just dropping out almost completely, I think that will be the point at which we feel like this is in the past. Anyway. Any quick take on that, actually, Jamarl? I know we got more headlines.
So if it goes, so it's weird, right? I mean, Fauci and these guys have been talking about it going into like next year. If we hit, I mean, the question becomes, is COVID something that just lingers? like where it just gets weaker and weaker as it goes further and further into the future. I mean, it's unknown. I mean, I can speculate, but it's unknown. I do understand where you're coming from, though. If we get to the point where it doesn't seem like we are changing our living patterns, our society, and everything else, then yeah, it's gone.
Yeah, and it's really about the pandemic, the classification of this disease as a pandemic. You see what I'm saying? In other words, a pandemic, it's like a disease spreading very virulently around the world.
Yeah. No, that makes sense.
Exactly.
It's not like a cold or flu that's specific to a particular place. It's the very definition of pandemic that you're talking about. Yeah, I think that's fair.
Where it's circulating around the world. Now, what could throw a spanner into my prediction there is if a lot of other countries don't have access to vaccines, if the situation in India continues to spiral out of control, as their upwards of 1.3 billion residents don't have nearly enough vaccines to go around, and it comes back in a big way there throughout the year, I could see something like that happening, and in which case, it would still be a global pandemic, but there would be pockets of, medical safety or whatever, pockets around the world, including pockets as large as the United States potentially. But maybe I'm getting ahead of myself. Maybe it's too early to think about how we can end this long, drawn-out 18-month, well, not 18-month, but year-plus lockdowns at this point. It's been a long time. It's dragging, Jamarl. Anyway, getting back to the headlines here, lawyers in Australia have launched a legal challenge against the Australian government as that government has banned the return of Australian citizens from India, which is facing a steep second wave as it regularly sees more than 300,000 new COVID cases per day. The Australian government has threatened to charge anyone who steps foot in Australia within 14 days of being in India with up to 5 years in prison and upwards of 66,000 Australian dollars. That's 50,000 American dollars in fines. Lawyers for a 73-year-old man named Gary Newman brought the case. There are currently over 9,000 Australian citizens living in India. In national political news back here in the States, former President Trump has launched a new service with which he can post his thoughts in a short format following his ban earlier this year from Facebook and Twitter. This comes as Facebook is set to announce a decision today from an outside advisory council on whether Trump will be allowed to return to the social media platform. This new timeline/blog for Trump can be accessed by going to donaldjtrump.com/desk, by the way. It's sort of, there's, as far as I can tell, there is no character limit. So you can go, he can go longer on Twitter there than, he can go longer there than he could on Twitter, but it has that feeling where I've seen it referred to as a blog, but if it's a blog, these are like extremely short blog posts. And of course they're all in Trump style with quite a few all caps words and, just the sort of abbreviated format that he became known for on Twitter. Anyway, also in the United States political news, in 2020, the United States birth rate dropped by its largest margin in over 50 years. The CDC said that 3.6 million babies were born in the U.S. last year, showing that the birth rate dropped 4% compared to the year before. In international news, foreign ministers for the G7 group are reconvening in London for their last day of talks, looking at the global distribution of the coronavirus. The Indian delegation is reportedly self-isolating. The Philippines has told its fishing fleet to continue working in a disputed region of the South China Sea, which has been restricted since 1999. It was restricted in order to preserve fish stocks in the area, with the South China Sea Task Force of the Philippines saying that this, quote, fishing ban does not apply to our fishermen, end quote. This follows heightened tensions between the two countries after China has allegedly repeatedly moved its ships into maritime regions under Philippine control. And some of these incidents, like they were moving their ships near the Spratlys, they got driven away, and then they brought their ships back to the Spratlys in the vicinity of the Spratly Islands a couple of days later. In some cases, they were saying that their ships were sheltering from, bad weather conditions, basically in the jurisdictionally Philippine waters. But I don't know. I'm not there, and I kind of wonder if U.S. naval forces are also in the area monitoring and are in some way a part of this narrative, this story. But I don't know. And it'd be good to get somebody on to talk about that. But anyway, this has been accelerating over the last couple of days, or at least it's been continuing. And now the Philippines, again, sending its fishing fleet to fish in waters when it's not supposed to send them there will only add a little bit more fuel to the fire. In Myanmar, Myanmar's national unity government, set up in opposition to the current junta, has formed a military organization called the People's Defense Force, quote unquote, which it says it will use to protect its supporters. This move is said to precede the creation of a federal union army, which the national unity government says it intends to use to, quote, make effective reforms in the security sector in order to terminate the 70-year-long civil war, end quote, that has riddled the country for multiple generations. If they can get power in the country, that's the big if here, because again, this is not the government of Myanmar. This is a sort of opposition government set up against the military coup government, the junta there. If they can get power again and they, create a new military force, which, by the way, it's just interesting to think about politically. Basically, of course, the military took over here. This opposition government is creating its own military, which I'm guessing would become the new one if they were to retake control of parliament and of the state in Myanmar. In other words, they've created their own force to sort of take over and replace the current force, which has just occupied the country and put its leaders out of power. This is the kind of thing I can see you being interested in on a deep level, Jamarl. We should bring KJ No. We've also been speaking with Carl Jha about this recently. We should have another conversation soon, just to talk about what the national unity government is doing, whether it faces any signs of success, how the different, whether it's the Karen or the Arakan, these different ethnic minority groups, how they fit into it, what side they're taking. The Karen seems to be the most active right now in basically fighting with the junta. What's your take?
Yeah, it's fascinating, right? It's politics at this extreme level where, like in the real schoolboy sense, people coming together under crisis and saying, we're going to create our own government from scratch. And we're going. Now the catch becomes, you're right. Are they pulling in other ethnic groups? How representative of it is the population itself? Because on some level, how representative it is of the population itself, and whether or not they can have some kind of opposition to the military is going to be what's important here. Because you can have the best ideas in the world. It's like the government comes together, it has the greatest ideas in the world of any government ever. It is cohesive in the way it's logic, in the way that it's put together. It can go on for millennia because of how it's structured, and it loses because it doesn't have guns and the military shoots its leaders in the face. So yeah, there's this secondary aspect of the politics in and of itself and how it's coming together. Whether or not it can bring the other groups together, I think that part is going to be the most important. And whether or not they're going to be able to basically create something that can withstand the military and grow and propagate in regards to something that is going to be acknowledged as a government. Yeah, this is fascinating politics.
And the thing is this 70-year-long civil war, think about that. That is the world's longest running continuous civil war. It's multiple generations within living memory. The vast majority of people living in the country have lived their entire lives under this civil conflict. And it was predicated not just on the legacy of colonialism, but also on the promise that a lot of these individual minority groups could at some point break away and create their own nation. So in other words, it's a bargain that I'm guessing the national unity government would have to make, but it'd be good to talk with somebody who's more authoritative here. If they decide to pitch in, are they going to get some deal, some commitment from the national unity government that by X date they will, begin a process of creating their own government, creating a breakaway state? Because if that's in the bargaining, would the national unity government go for that? It's like it's a deal that I don't see them making, but they might have to.
It would destroy the country
if they want to work with them.
Yeah,
it would literally. It would break it up into, yeah.
So I don't know.
Yes. Anyway,
that deal might be too much. They may be paying too much for that muffler if that's what they're going for. No, whatever the deal they make, and I don't know what the deal is. I mean, the deal may just be, we will push back against the military junta. We will push back against the coup government. It might be as straightforward, as simple as that, where all of these guys just agree, we don't like this. And in conjunction as such, come together and push back against what they don't particularly like. So I don't know.
Yes.
I mean, it's really interesting politics. And you're right. We need to get either KJ No or somebody else on to talk about it, because it's heating up. The moment where you get an organization that can push back, you become something. And how does the military deal with this? Does the military get hyperbolic at this point to try to destroy the opposition that's biting and so forth? Yeah, this gets really interesting in regards to the politics of it.
Yep. Yeah, absolutely. Those are headlines. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We're going into a break, but we'll be back with our soapbox segment, Jamarl's monologue, and our back and forth. Be right back on the other side of this short break.
Fault Lines.
What's the most important hour of the day? It's the Critical Hour with Dr. Wilmer Leon. On this show, we don't just deliver the latest headlines. We divide the real from the fake. Tune in to hear from some of the most brilliant political minds of today. Get in-depth news and analysis that goes beyond the surface and dig straight into the details. Set your clock to the Critical Hour for a news perspective unlike any of those other guys. Tune in to the Critical Hour with Dr. Wilmer Leon, weekdays 6 to 7 p.m. Eastern, and catch us on Facebook Live. You're listening to Radio Sputnik.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined by my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. If you guys live in the area, you can catch us on radio at 105.5 FM and 1390 AM. We're also in Kansas City at 102.9 FM and 104.7 FM. If you guys are digging what Shane and I are putting down, whatever platform you're consuming this content on, give us a like and share that audio or video. You can also join in on the conversation with a chat, a tweet, and of course, by phone at 202-521-1320. That is 202-521-1320. Your engagement helps makes the show what it is, so definitely don't be shy. So I want to talk about Rick Santorum. Rick Santorum has been in politics for a very, very long time. And one of the perks of age is that you remember when people are in politics and you remember some of the ways that they were perceived early on. Rick Santorum was always a goofball in regards to the political sphere. Some of the things that he was saying when he was running for president, and apparently that goofballness hasn't necessarily gone anywhere. Santorum got a lot of people angry about a statement that he made about Native Americans. Now, in one sense, he's right. In another sense, it's still, I guess, annoying the fact that he's even bringing this up, and in the context that he's bringing this up. And a lot of people took this as offensive. Let's play the clip before we continue.
If you think about this country, I don't know of any other country in the world that was settled predominantly by people who were coming to practice their faith. They came here because they were not allowed to practice their particular faith in their own country. And so they came here mostly from Europe, and they set up a country that was based on Judeo-Christian principles. If you think of other countries like Italy and Greece and China and Turkey and places like that, they've all sort of changed over time. I mean, they've been there for millennia in many cases. And their culture has sort of evolved over time. But not us. We came here and created a blank slate. We birthed a nation from nothing. I mean, there was nothing here. I mean, yes, we have Native Americans, but candidly, that there isn't much Native American culture in American culture.
Yeah, that didn't go over well. There isn't much Native American culture in American culture. But here's the thing, though. Is he entirely wrong? Now, from the standpoint of the nation stuff, an argument can be made that when people got here, a nation is a conceptual device. It's not a real thing in the sense of a real thing. It's not something you put your hands on. It's okay, here's a nation. Any more than the government, when you put your hands on a building and say, I'm touching the government. Not so much. A nation is a conceptual item. It's a legal fiction of sorts. And if you could make an argument that you could get here, even if somebody else was here, the nation was birthed with the arrival of new people. The issue here, though, I think that people take issue with, yes, that part of the Native American history, I think it is part of our government, meaning in the way that we were structured our government and some of the Native American populations that was here. But also there are aspects of this culture throughout the United States. But I think it's a hard case to make that it survived us coming here. I mean, there are reservations, but I don't think reservations are, for the most part, what people are talking about when they're talking about the survival of Native American culture. He was hit heavily for this. People, all sorts of ridicule was piled upon him for this. And again, I really do think that it has more to do with the idea that we committed a genocide, and on top of the ashes of that genocide, built a nation. I think that's the issue that people have with this more than anything else, even if they don't articulate it that way. It's usually articulated as, what do you mean there's nothing here that exceeded for Native American history? What do you mean by that is brand new, that nothing was here? Well, on some level, he's wrong. On some level, he's right. I guess it just depends on how you think about what he's saying. How does CNN deal with this? That's the question. Because this is a CNN contributor, and all sorts of questions are like, hey, that guy should be fired, CNN. I am not of mind that Rick Santorum should be fired. I don't believe Mark Lamont should have been fired. I think it was somebody else that got fired. Just because you give a goofball opinion doesn't necessarily mean you should get fired. I would much prefer, as opposed to having Trump sitting on Gab somewhere or whatever the platform he's on that he's created, I would much prefer him somewhere where he can make that case, make that argument, and have somebody else sitting right there with him that would put that argument into the ground. Or, in the odd cases where Santorum is right, where Santorum wins the argument. What I don't want is Santorum having his own little area where a bunch of Santorums are looking at the world in a particular way in their own bubble without necessarily having anything coming at them when they say stuff like this. If they believe that what Santorum said here was so offensive, it would have been nice for them to kind of engage that point. When they did bring Santorum back on, because he is a CNN contributor, and in order to be back on, he has to be bathed anew. Well, how do you bathe a person anew? How does CNN get Rick Santorum on without having a huge amount of flack and pushback for doing so? You have to have him be born anew. He needs to be washed in the fires of criticism. He has to walk the plank. And the plank starts with Chris Cuomo. It ends with Don Lemon nearly breaking down in tears about what Rick Santorum said. Let's play Chris Cuomo and hear what Cuomo has to say about this and Rick Santorum's apology. That's the wild part, because his apology is almost worse than the statement itself, because you can make a case that Native American history has been destroyed. I mean, arguably, that's part of the problem, that the genocide was a destruction of culture. But I think his response is worse. Let's play the clip.
Rick, two problems. One, it's not accurate. There is a lot of affect from the Native culture on America. And there are a lot of people here who believe in that. And this seemed like you were trying to erase diversity in the interest of some white Christian right.
No. What, just to be clear, what I was not saying is that Native American culture. I misspoke. I was saying what I was talking about is, as you can see from the run-up, I was talking about the founding of our country. I'd given a long talk about the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence and the ideas behind those, and that I was saying we sort of created that anew, if you will, and I was not trying to dismiss Native Americans. In fact, I mentioned that because, yes, they were here and they did have an impact. In fact, in this country, you're right. They have a huge impact, particularly in the West and many other areas of the country where they have a huge impact on American culture. I was talking about, and I misspoke in this respect, I was talking about the founding and the principles embodied in the founding. I would never, and people have said, oh, I'm trying to, dismiss what we did to the Native Americans. Far from it. The way we treated Native Americans was horrific. It goes against every bone and everything I've ever fought for as a leader in the Congress. I believe, as our founding document says, that we are endowed by Creator with unalienable rights and that we are all equal. And when we treat people as other or less than human, that's when every country gets into problem. We did it with the Native Americans. We did it with respect to African Americans. I believe we're doing it with children in the womb today. So this is very personal and very passionate that we can't treat people as different or other, and we get into a lot of problems. So I wasn't saying any of the things that the social media world is saying that I was saying. I was simply talking about the founding documents of the United States, not the colonies, but the United States was based on these principles.
Let's stop right there. He mentions slavery, he mentions genocide of Native Americans, and then he turns around and says he believes that abortion is akin to slavery and the genocide of Native Americans. I mean, this is a worse response than the ensuing thing, meaning the thing that got him in trouble. I think this is worse than that. A mother, because she can't pay for her kid or that she doesn't want to take care of her kid, It is better, full stop, for that mother to get rid of that kid as opposed to have that kid and have people like Rick Santorum not want to pony up to take care of him. Abortion is not slavery, and abortion is not genocide. Shane, what are your thoughts on this? We only have about a minute left, but even if we need to push it for a little bit, what are your thoughts?
Well, it took a turn there. I mean, and you know, it makes sense that you're going to comment on that part, but that wasn't what I was anticipating responding to. We could talk about that, and so I'll say briefly, I'm in favor of the right to choose whether or not you have a kid on the part of women. Having said that, like most people, if I were a woman, I would think I wouldn't like to get an abortion. It's not something that I would want to do. I wouldn't want to be put in a position where I had to do that.
Yeah, I don't think anybody's like, yes, give me that abortion.
Yeah, exactly. And that argument kind of cuts both ways. If you were living in a more functional society where a single income could support not just one, but more than one kids, and where people weren't being put in situations where they were regularly having kids either out of wedlock or single parents in general, that would also be a more functional society. Yes. And so I feel like there's a nuanced conversation to be had here that I could make and I could have, but I wanted to come back on the Native American comments because that's what started this whole thing. Nothing that he said there to me seems factually incorrect. And that's what seems wild about the pushback on this, which maybe it's being blown up. And maybe like we were talking about off the show the other day, probably CNN is hitting on him on this so damn hard between Don Lemon and Chris Cuomo. Chris Cuomo, who of course has many other things to apologize for, which he himself hasn't done yet. I mean, I'm talking specifically about his heavy-handed support for his brother Andrew Cuomo, despite widespread allegations of sexual harassment and complete mishandling of the coronavirus crisis, hiding deaths in nursing homes. Anyway, that's far afield. They're probably treating Rick Santorum. They're taking their kid gloves off because he is a CNN contributor. He's been a longtime contributor to their platform. They want to hit him hard so they can show that they retain their moral purity, so they can keep their position on the high horse. Another way of looking at this in general is it's part of the whole culture war thing. It's part of the pushback against any appearance of racism in politics, in our society in general. And to be frank, it doesn't seem like there have been that. If you look at the historical precedent, if you look at the history of the KKK and all this stuff, it doesn't actually seem like there have been that many public instances of right-wing people being outright racist recently. And so I would see this as a sort of grasping onto what is available, even if it's not actually all that bad objectively, even if it's leaving stuff out. He didn't directly try to justify the genocide of Native Americans. He called it abhorrent, all that stuff. He was defensive. He was on the defensive in this interview, clearly. It feels like it's sort of grasping at straws to me.
I agree with you.
What's your take on that?
No, I agree.
I know we need to close, but
yeah, we have to close it. But look, I mean, I get that people take issue with. I mean, the thing is, he didn't defend it, and maybe he should have defended it. Like, maybe his argument should have been, look, I'm not saying anything about the genocide of Native Americans. That's not what I'm arguing about. I'm talking about the founding of the country, and that when we wipe them out, you can't make a case that says, you guys are angry at me for getting rid of a genocide, but genocide means erasing the culture in and of itself. So which one is it? Like, he didn't fight that ground. Like, his thing was just like, all right, fair enough. I'm not.
I wish he would have. That would have made for a much more interesting conversation than like backing up 20 feet into another unrelated argument, bringing abortion into it. Right. Just, you know what I mean?
Yeah, he made it worse.
Because that's technically that's the thing that is the claim that Native Americans make. Right. I've heard I believe we've had them on our show talking about how they were systematically, not just oppressed but killed en masse, driven back regionally, time after time after time, into increasingly smaller portions of the country, and then what we're living with in the legacy of that is like the increasing capitalization of their identity, yes. Making their identity a politically and socially expedient tool to be appropriated by outside forces. That almost seems like a left-wing argument, even though I'm not necessarily coming at this from a left-wing perspective. Does, right? It's but like that means cultural erasure. Yeah, that means that their culture has been erased.
And if you erase the culture, how is he wrong? I mean, right? I mean, but he didn't make that case. His case was like, all right, fair enough. I'm not having this fight. I was wrong. Like, that was his thing. I don't want to be in this fight. All right. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We're going to be back with Peter Oliver. Less COVID, but more problems. Back in a moment.
Fault Lines.
You're listening to Radio Sputnik.
Want to know how international issues fit into local ones and how local issues fit into international ones with the historical context to tie them together? Well, we're bringing it to you all by any means necessary. Tune in weekdays from 2 to 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time to hear me, Jackie Lukman, alongside my co-host Sean Blackman. By any means necessary, your guide to connecting the social, political, and economic movements shaping the world around us.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined by my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. So we've been following the news in Germany and in Europe, especially from the standpoint of their COVID vaccination program. And Germany has not necessarily done as well as, let's say, the United States with the vaccination program. And Europe, as a union, has had certain problems with conflict in regards to who's going to get the vaccinations, how those vaccinations are going to be passed between borders, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It has not necessarily been an easy way going for Europe. But the EU has this notion of, well, what are you going to do when people get vaccines and they want to move throughout Europe? Well, Germany has the idea, or the EU Commission has put forward the idea of a digital green document, a vaccine passport. They want to call it a vaccine passport, but for all intents and purposes, that's what it is. You can call it a hot potato, but it is basically a vaccine passport. This does not necessarily look favorably by some of the nations when some of the other nations think it's a good idea. As you can imagine, this has caused conflict. To have a conversation about the conflict that is taking place over the vaccine passport, we're joined with Peter Oliver. He's the EU correspondent for RT International, providing daily coverage of political, diplomatic, and economic news from across the European Union. Peter, thank you for joining us.
Hello. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So a vaccine passport is not a vaccine passport. And yeah, I can imagine that this is going to cause some problems, especially if some people are for it and other people are not. I mean, we don't even know if the immunity of the vaccines will last for X amount of time. So a person could have a passport with an immunity that is not necessarily up to snuff. What are your thoughts? What has been taking place in regards to the quote unquote digital green document, as it's being called?
Yes. Well, it has a new name already. They are desperate not to call it a vaccine passport. It is now called the EU COVID-19 certificate. That's after MEPs, members of the European Parliament, decided that the digital green certificate name was too vague compared to what it actually does. But they didn't go as far as to call it a COVID a vaccination passport. Yes, you're right in what you say. One of the reasons people have voiced a little concern about putting in place these type of documents, and when I say people, I'm including the World Health Organization in this, that they're saying it could be giving a false sense of security, because we know that these vaccines in the short and middle term can provide protection against COVID-19. We don't know how long that lasts for. We simply don't know on the proportions that we've vaccinated people. And to give somebody a document that allows them to then travel free as can be, well, that could potentially provide problems down the road. There's also splits within the...
Yeah, we also don't know whether the variants are going to be...
Exactly. What is on the other side of that argument is the tourism industry, for one. In Europe, if you look at the southern European states on the Mediterranean, your Spain, your Italy, your Greece, your Malta, your Croatia, I'm sure I've missed somebody off who'll be angry with me, but they rely very heavily on tourism, and not having those tourist beaches and those tourist resorts open last year, that has caused a lot of problems economically. They want them open. They want those tourists there. One of those countries, and in fact almost all of them, have already implemented some way of their own ideas about how to do this. Spain is already trialing its own coronavirus passport. Italy unveiled a pass back in April. Sweden has also put in place one in Austria. In fact, the Austrian Chancellor just this morning said, we're not going to wait around for the European Union as a whole to put in place this document. Ours is going to be in place and operating by May the 19th. Those nations, and if you look at in Austria, 5.6% of GDP, it's not the largest amount compared to countries like Italy and Spain and Greece, but people are dependent on tourists coming to them, and that requires people being able to travel. So you've got this block between COVID numbers have started to get a little better in places, particularly here in Germany, where I'm speaking to you from. We've seen the all-important figures about how many new infections are arriving and how much of a percentage of intensive care is taken up by COVID patients. All of those numbers are dropping, and the vaccination rate is skyrocketing at the moment here. At one point last week, Germany vaccinated over 1 million people in one day. So huge strides taken there, considering that there was problems to start with. Now, we had been promised for a long time that this second quarter of 2021 would be where those problems were sorted out. They currently seem like they're on track to do a lot of that. Here in Berlin, you're supposed to be able to get a vaccine very easily. I'm finding it a little harder at the moment. Every time everybody I call seems to have just given away their last appointment. But that's by the by. I'm sure that's just me. From what I'm hearing and what I'm seeing, there are plenty of appointments available and plenty of doses, particularly of the AstraZeneca vaccine, available, as long as your physician, your GP would be called, or your family doctor, there we go, that's the word I was looking for more generically, gives you the all clear to be able to have that. Now, what we're seeing, though, is also opposition when it comes to these vaccine passports from national leaders, because it would create a two-tier society, basically. You've heard the Irish Taoiseach, the Irish Prime Minister, Michael Martin, saying that if you have this as a Europe-wide document, what's stopping it being used internally as you don't have your green passport, you're not coming in? And what does that mean for the differences between those people who've had their vaccination, those that are waiting for a vaccination, and what about those that can't have a vaccination because of a multitude of different medical situations? Now, that there are big worries about creating that type of two-tier society, and there's also a lot of concern over the way that this is going to be done through technology. Now, we've talked in the past about technology here in Germany and how, the fax machine is still operational when it comes to dealing with government, particularly here in Berlin. Now, they're talking about putting what could be some very important information when it comes to you being able to travel and move about into an app that requires QR codes and technology. Now, Peter, Germany's a very innovative country.
I'm curious.
Yeah,
does the EU have any power over domestic affairs? Like, could the EU say, okay, we're going to put a nationwide ban for people to stay in the house, or a nationwide ban for people to wear masks, and it goes supranational?
No.
Yeah. Okay, so its powers are somewhat limited.
What you have is its powers are limited, but what you have is you have the European Commission that operates as an executive branch in terms of creating. It can create rules, laws, everything like that. Those rules and laws have to be passed by both the European Parliament, which is made up of representatives of all the different nations, but also, perhaps probably more importantly, by the European Council, which is made up of the heads of state and government of the 27 member states. Now, the reason that they're talking about the EU as a whole, Brussels as a whole, you'll hear it talked about like that, or the European Commission specifically, has no right to be able to say, Greece, Jamarl and Shane can't fly over from Washington and go and hang out on your beaches. They can't, or Spain, they can't go to Sagrada Familia and have a look at that in Barcelona. They can't do that. But the reason that they're talking about this is because the 27 heads of government and state came together at the beginning of the pandemic and said, we're putting this brake on as a block. So what they're trying to do is take the brake off as a block. Now, that's where we run into these problems, because there are those countries that want these things open much quicker than others. Now, as I mentioned, for economic reasons, those southern nations want them open. Here in Germany, they'll be voting in Parliament tomorrow on giving vaccinated people more rights, because while it seems to be split between North and South in Europe over who wants freedom of movement opened up a lot more, Germany stands as a bit of an outlier. People want things open here right now. I think if you gave the many Germans a chance to walk to Mallorca for 2 weeks in an all-inclusive resort, they'd bite your hands off for it. Particularly some of my neighbours I've spoken to, desperate for a vacation. People have
because. So, from my understanding of European Union politics, if all of the member nations come together, that basically allows them to create law or something similar to law, where instead of it having to go through the parliament and everything else, if all of them agree, then all of them agree. Am I getting that right?
You're just about right. Yes, it will have to go through. Like currently, we're looking at the COVID bailout money that goes on top of the budget. Now, that was held up. That has to be agreed on by all of the heads of government. They then put it to their individual parliaments and they vote that through. Now, here in Germany, there was a legal challenge to that. So it had to go through the court system again. Now, currently, the only nation I think that's holding up the COVID bill is the parliament in Finland. And there's a lot of people looking at their watches, tapping their fists and whistling in the direction of Helsinki at the moment, thinking like, come on, we need that 750 billion euro.
Well, what I was getting at is the fact that all of the nations agreed for lockdown. All of them have to agree for the lockdown to be removed. Is that true? Does that make sense?
Well, gist of it, they do have powers to be able to open themselves up without having that overarching agreement, but it starts to get messy. This is where European politics does get very messy, and nothing is ever as simple because there is self-interest in every single one of the individual nations. It's always going to be different. When you've got obviously the French government has to appease the French people. Right. They've already put in place their own system for flights to in and out of Corsica for France. You've got Spain doing their own thing, Sweden, Italy, Austria, Denmark. Everybody looks at how they can best appease their own people. But then, of course, they've also got to act unilaterally as one bloc as the European Union.
Very wild politics. That's fascinating. Because I guess my point is, it's like if all of these guys come together and say, okay, we're going to put a ban on this stuff, then great. Well, the moment that the countries say, okay, well, we're tired of this ban, well, the ban remains. I mean, until all of them agree again, or I would imagine it goes through some kind of parliamentary act where they say, okay, yes, we agree in this kind of majority rule to take off the ban. I mean, I just want to make sure I'm not mistaking that.
No.
What does that process actually look like? I guess I'm specifically curious. What would it take? Is it going to be a parliamentary ruling in which some countries are going to be overruled? Or what does that process look like, Peter?
Well, what you're going to have is on Monday, you saw the European Commission, which is that executive branch, put forward their idea for this document, this thing. It goes through the European Parliament. They've been discussing it on Friday or Thursday. I need to double check my dates there. There will be a European Council meeting. Now, at that council meeting, those are the ones where Angela Merkel sits with, Emmanuel Macron sits with the leaders of all of the other European EU nations. That's where they'll give it the rubber stamp one way or the other, and where usually you're expected some kind of, not so much quid pro quo, but somebody will step down on one of their arguments in favor of the group. And, they will usually these things get remembered and they're brought back up when it's an issue that's much more important to that particular state. So by the end of this week, we could see this pushed through. It then has to get approved by all of the individual parliaments in each of the 27 states. So it isn't
the trick.
Yeah,
that is any one country that doesn't want to do it, it's not just a supermajority or something like that. Any one country that doesn't want to open travel back up can block it, which is why this is one of the problems. We need to close this segment. We're going to come back with you, continuing this conversation. I also wanted to get into the AstraZeneca vaccine. the AZ vaccine and how that is being handled, because like you said, that is being selectively administered. But I want to hear on what criteria and how different countries are dealing with this. Again, the blood clotting issue, that's a marginal but a serious concern for some people. And I want to get back into exactly what criteria they're using to deliver that, whether it's young men, men in general, older women, those kinds of things. I'm guessing they're just keeping it from young women, who seem to be the primary victims of that sort of statistical rare anomaly when it comes to a side effect of getting the AstraZeneca vaccine. Anyway, we need to go to a break. We are joined by Peter Oliver. We'll be back with him in a minute. He's the EU correspondent for RT International, covering diplomatic, political, and economic news from across the EU. You're listening to Fault Lines. We'll be back with Peter in just a minute.
Fault Lines.
Feeling kind of blue, but maybe also kind of red, and kind of purple, and kind of alone? You've got a friend on Radio Sputnik. Tune into Political Misfits from 12 to 2 Eastern Time, Monday through Friday, for news, politics, and culture without the two-party bias. Catch us daily on 105.5 in Washington, D.C., or 102.9 or 104.7 in Kansas City. Or find us on Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, Spotify, or wherever you get your news.
Fault Lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan, and we are joined by Peter Oliver. He is the EU correspondent for RT International, providing daily coverage of political, diplomatic, and economic news from across the European Union. You can follow Peter on Twitter at PeterGOliver_RT. Also catch his reporting weekly on RT International. Peter, thank you again for being with us. I want to get right back into this conversation. With AstraZeneca, you mentioned that this is being administered, that this is what's largely available in Berlin, where you live. We were talking a while back about this because, of course, not only AstraZeneca, but the Johnson & Johnson shot was coming under quite a bit of scrutiny for a little while there over this rare medical condition, cerebral venous sinus thrombosis, this rare blood clotting condition, which is highly fatal for a lot of people who got it, and which seems to be correlated with both of these adenovirus-based vaccines. Anyway, we were talking at the time, I was bringing up the idea, okay, if both of these shots, but specifically the AZ vaccine, just because we're talking about it, if this causes this condition primarily in younger women, which it seemed to, in fact, it seemed almost exclusively to be causing this condition in younger middle-aged women, why not just restrict its use where vaccines are otherwise available to people outside of that age and just outside of that demographic, whether it's younger men, older men, and older women? That seems to be the sort of, if you have some alternatives, use those alternatives where they make sense in younger women, and then use the AZ vaccine, which seems to be a lot more widely available in the EU, even though there have been definite problems getting it that way. In those other groups, is that what's happening? What is the situation? How is it being prescribed? Where is it being used, Peter?
Here, and anecdotally of talking to friends who fit into various different groups in Berlin, it's basically you can get an AstraZeneca vaccine here if you speak to your family doctor. Your family doctor looks through if you've got any history of any complaints that would perhaps put you higher up a risk league table, and if they give you the all clear, they'll give you an AstraZeneca vaccine. Whether they are young women, young men, older women, older men, that seems to be the case. I don't know of anybody who's gone to their family doctor and the doctor said, you probably shouldn't have this. Now, what we're seeing is a number of people being able to get those type of vaccines. They're also handing out the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine here in Germany as well. And I know a few people who've received that one, but at the moment, the vaccination system is moving very quickly, but it's incredibly fluid at the moment as well. The rules on who should be able to go and get a vaccine have changed quite dramatically in the last 7 days. On Monday, I was just scrolling through Twitter there, and I saw it pop up something that said, if you're a journalist, you're now in the third priority group, and you should be able to go and get your vaccine. Now, that had come out of nowhere as far as I was looking at. I hadn't seen anything like that. It is the case. If you are a reporter like myself, you're supposed to be able to go and get a vaccine. Unfortunately, not many appointments available at the moment for those with the official vaccination centres, so you have to go through your family doctor. It's quite complicated. When you talked about the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, that's not been talked about so much here because Johnson & Johnson themselves put a tactical delay on their rollout of the vaccine here after they suspended the use in the United States. So there hasn't been much talk about that. But ultimately, the issue with the AstraZeneca vaccine and the blood clotting problems that had occurred in a small number of people, the overarching message has been that one that had been put out by Emir Cook, who's the boss of the European Medicines Agency, as well as the World Health Organization. It said that their overarching opinion is the benefits of being vaccinated far outweigh the risks that could potentially be posed. And that's why when it comes to the AZ vaccine, a lot of people are being asked to consult their physician before they go and get it. And that seems to be the way that it's working. Nobody's got too many concerns about that here.
And that almost sounds something like a rubber stamping. I don't want to read too much into it, but if everybody you know is being approved for that, I don't know what, and it would be good. We've had doctors on, and from what the conversations we've had, it seemed like they were still investigating exactly what correlated with the incidence of this rare condition, the cerebral venous sinus thrombosis that we're talking about. Exactly, what they would be looking for. But it seems like that's still preliminary. So it almost sounds like they're using this process to simply approve it, to give people a sense of certainty and security when they go in to get it, to make them feel like, they're not going to get this blood clotting condition. I don't know. Maybe I'm reading too much into it. But if everybody is being approved for it, that might just be the equivalent of a lollipop to make you feel better, only before you go in and get the shot instead of after. With the vaccination situation, you can feel free to, obviously comment on that if you disagree too. But with the vaccine situation in general, Germany has a population approximately 1/4 of America's. It's about 330 million in the States compared to about 83 million, I think it is, in Germany, which is why 1 million in a day is actually, we're seeing almost 1 million in a day over the past week or so in the U.S. That is significantly higher in Germany. But you also say that the vaccine situation there is fluid. What did you mean by that? Why is it fluid? I'm guessing you mean it's kind of coming and going. What's causing that, Peter?
I think at the moment it's really down to where vaccines are and getting them in people's arms. There are huge vaccination centers in Berlin, but as I said, there's also doctors' offices that are handing them out. But doctors' offices are getting a trickle through of the jabs. I mean, I'm on a waiting list with my family doctor, and I spoke to them and they said, well, it could be you'll get it sometime in the next 4 months, because I'm 38, relatively healthy, pretty healthy, really. I don't tick any of the boxes for increased risk of COVID, apart from being a journalist, which should put me, according to the new rules that came out on Monday, higher up that list. But yeah, that's when I say it's fluid. It's a little like that, because I know people that have called up their particular family doctor and they've said, do you know what? Come in right now and I'll stick you with the needle. That's just because they've called at that right time when they've had those doses of the vaccine.
And you sound positively sanguine. You were hedging a little bit on whether you're healthy. You sound good.
I think you have to be, because I mean I'm desperate to get that vaccine. I haven't seen my parents or my family back in the United Kingdom since December 2019. So this vaccine's pretty much going to be a prerequisite when it comes to travel. And I'm pretty desperate to see some of those guys, No, I say some of those guys.
I hear you.
Those guys.
No, that's a year and a half now. That's been a long time. I want to, from another angle, just yesterday, Biden sort of set another goal: 70% of American adults vaccinated by July 4th. Just 2 months away at this point, and it was 2 months by the date, not to the day, but 2 months yesterday, May 4th, when he announced this. Anyway. Well, have we seen something similar in Germany? Do they have sort of goals and timelines? We just haven't been hearing about this in the States, either in Germany or across the EU as a whole. What are they, Peter?
Election time in September. We have been promised, every adult in Germany will have been offered a vaccine by September. That I'm sure it's purely coincidental that runs alongside the time Germans are going to be going into their voting booths, but that's when everybody's supposed to have been offered at least their first injection. That's everybody over the age of 18. We were very, very far away from making that just a month ago. 2 months ago, it seemed very ambitious. Right now, it still seems like an ambitious target, but one that, if they continue at the current rates that they're continuing at, shouldn't be too far away from being reached, if it's not reached entirely. So I think as long as the issues with getting vaccines into the country or into the countries of the EU that we saw in the beginning of the year, as long as they have gone by the wayside as they seem to have done, we should be on track to meet that. But I think as I mentioned, that election, particularly the ruling Christian Democratic Union Party and their sister party, the Christian Social Union, they're putting a lot of stock on, a lot of stall in making sure that we're the party that got you vaccinated.
That timeline is a little bit too on the nose there. But again, if what's fluid now becomes a flood, it sounds like they could do it. Peter, thank you for joining us. We've got to close. Appreciate it, though.
Bye-bye.
For those listening, that was Peter Oliver, the EU correspondent for RT International. Follow him on Twitter, PeterG.Oliver_RT. Catch his reporting weekly on RT International. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We will be back in a minute with headlines and another 2 hours of today's show.
Listening to Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
Fault lines.
Live from the divided states of America, precipitously perched at the edge of this resilient and exploited globe. Welcome to your context lens for the American perspective. In the left corner, I am your ever vigilant, your indefatigable political analyst, Jamarl Thomas.
And in the independent corner, I am your political analyst, Shane Stranahan.
That would strongly imply you are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Let's get to the headlines. Really interesting conversation with Peter Oliver, but I always enjoy Oliver. He's very affable, and I am a sucker for European politics, so there's that. So let's do the headlines. In the news, at least 40,531 new COVID cases were reported in the United States yesterday, with 890 new deaths. Over the past week, there's been an average of 48,003 cases per day, a decrease of 26% from the average 2 weeks earlier. 32% of the American public has been fully vaccinated, and 45% of residents have received at least one dose. As of this morning, the coronavirus has infected more than 32,539,178 people across the United States and has killed about 578,010 human beings. Mothers, fathers, daughters, teachers, husbands, etc. President Biden has set a goal of at least partially vaccinating 70% of the adult Americans by July 4th, saying that his administration is, quote, going to make it easier than ever to get vaccinated, unquote. So far, 145 million adults, or 56% of the adult population, has received at least one dose of a COVID vaccine, with almost 1 million adults being added to that total for each day of the week, although the total rate of vaccinations has actually slowed since its peak 3 weeks ago. Yeah, I agree with Shane's assessment. We've done quite well on the vaccinations. The interesting thing is vaccine diplomacy. So if you remember, Jen Psaki basically made the point that says Russia and China, the problem with them and the way that they're distributing vaccines is that they don't have any strings attached. Well, we are dealing with Mexico with strings attached in regards to the AstraZeneca vaccine or the vaccine stores that we have at our disposal. And part of that is basically you need to militarize your, let's say, basically prevent migrants from coming to our shores. And if you do that, we will dispatch the vaccine that we know you need because of so many people that are dying in the country. Vaccine diplomacy. The other interesting thing, though, is Joe Biden. When Joe Biden had a conversation with Andy Barkin, and Joe Biden looked Andy Barkin in the eye, looked a dying man in the eye, and told him that, yes, I would release those vaccines. I would not let patents stand in the way of third world countries or other countries getting vaccines in case of a world emergency. Well, it's a world emergency, and yes, the third world countries are having difficulties procuring the vaccines, large part because of the patents. Yes, they can make them themselves if they had the opportunity to do so. And no, this is another promise that Joe Biden has not lived up to. Just like the $15 an hour minimum wage, just like the PRO Act, just like the removing marijuana off the scheduling, something that he could do, and even the $10,000 in student loan relief. I mean, that's like measly. Honestly, we should get rid of all of it, or at the very least, get rid of $50K. I mean, 600,000 people have nearly died. But this is something else that he has not done. Whether you like the idea or not, I'm just making the point that it's something he promised he'd do, and he didn't do. Lawyers launched a legal challenge against the Australian government as it banned the return of Australian citizens from India, which is facing a steep second wave as it regularly sees more than 300,000 new COVID cases per day. The Australian government has threatened to charge anyone who steps foot in Australia with 14 days of being in India, with up to 5 years in prison and upwards of 66,000 Australian dollars, or 50,000 in the United States dollars, and fines. Lawyers for a 73-year-old man named Gary Newman brought the case. There are currently over 9,000 Australian citizens living in India. That is aggressive. In fact, that doesn't even make sense. If you needed to quarantine somebody who's coming back into the country that's an Australian citizen for a period of time to see whether or not they have COVID, that seems to be a better alternative than putting people in prison and charging them $50,000. It just seems unhinged. Former President Trump has launched a new service with which he can post his thoughts in a short format following his ban earlier this year from Facebook and Twitter. This comes as Facebook is set to announce a decision today from an outside advisory council on whether Trump will be allowed to return to the social media platform. The new timeline/blog for Trump can be accessed by going to donaldjtrump.com/desk. This advisory council is for Facebook. From my understanding, Trump has been banned permanently from Twitter. Now, this is losing tons of money for Twitter on this front, and it seems like they got rid of him once the money might have expended because he was no longer going to be president. The interesting question is, if Trump won that presidential election, would Twitter have gotten rid of Trump? I suspect not. But in this very particular case, Donald Trump is on his own platform. Look, this is not good. And I don't mean it's not good because Donald Trump is speaking. No, it's not that. It's not good that we're splitting up our commons, where some people are going to aggregate to this commons over here, and you're going to have this kind of cellar dwellers to kind of foment whatever they foment. And when that group is not able to be directed, talked to, where they're not shared in the larger conversation, I think you create problems. I don't think the way to deal with somebody like Donald Trump, or the way to deal with somebody who's putting out ridiculous stuff, and I've become more hardened on this position, because think of the alternative. The alternative is the problem, the sliding door, as Shane would say. The alternative is the problem. So let's say you have mainstream media that basically are stenographers for state. I don't know how this could be argued with at this point. They get leaks. They get things from either the FBI, the CIA, or some kind of other intelligence branch. They publish those things. The press talks about it for a few days. You find out that they were wrong a few days later. Nobody cares. They just move on. And that process rinses and repeats. That's what you get. An arm of basically the state, where certain things can't be discussed, certain conversations don't come up. And you get social media, where social media has those conversations. They have those fights. YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, all of that stuff gets hashed out on social media. But what happens when it gets to the point where YouTube no longer shows those conversations? YouTube becomes a hub for corporate media. And it becomes a hub for corporate media. It's logical, it makes sense. I mean, basically you have a situation where they want to do the cat video of news, and the cat video of news just so happens to be corporate media. And so in that very particular context, social media, they wouldn't have to worry about whether or not this comment goes too far. They don't have to worry about being attacked for something that somebody might have said on the platform. No, they can ensconce themselves in the safety of the cat videos of information, mainstream news. And that's what they're going to go with. But think for what that means. If a lot of mainstream news is basically stenography, then what does social media become in that context and in that world? It becomes just this pushing aside any kind of conversation that trends the line of something that people don't necessarily want to talk about or could be potentially attacked for. Yes, there will be lunatics. There will be goofballs and screwballs. But this goes to the Santorum thing again. Do I want Santorum in his own little world fomenting a bunch of Santorums, or do I want Santorum to be somewhere where somebody can respond to Santorum and say, you are full of it, and explain why he's full of it? And when you're going to get some cantankerous people and everything else. But what you hope is that there's some people who listen to that who's like, yeah, that guy's right. Santorum is a goofball. Whereas if Santorum and his Santorums are left to their own devices in their own aspect of the web, then there is no potential for somebody to say, yes, that guy's a goofball. Instead, it's like, hey, that guy's making some really good sense there. I don't want that. I think that's worse. And so, no, I don't think it's a good eventuality that Donald Trump has basically created his own site. And whether Trump realizes it or not, if that site gets overboard, that site and everybody on it can be shut down by themselves. Meaning, just because you foment yourself somewhere else doesn't necessarily give you protection that you think you're getting. No, I don't think this is a good reality. I do think that from the standpoint of speech, people need to be able to make their say. And they should be able to have that say in somewhat of an open forum in regard to what we call our commons. But we don't own our commons. The commons are basically owned by multinational corporations that are being pressured by state to behave in a particular way. That needs to change. And the question is, how does that change? Is it one of the cases where anywhere you go is where you at? That when something is built like this, even if you put it under the auspices of state, you may make the problem worse. But I don't know where you get a better situation from that. I mean, ultimately, you need the capacity for people to be able to get their take. And if it's held up to the power of just a singular individual or a very small body of people, then I think that's worse. So, anywhere you are is where you're at. I don't think there's an easy solution to the problem. But let's keep going. We have more headlines. In 2020, the United States birth rate dropped by its largest margin in over 50 years. The CDC said that 3.6 million babies were born in the United States last year, showing the birth rate had dropped 4% compared to last year before. Genocide. Shane, genocide. Genocide. Our people are dying. What's going on? We're killing our population. Now, the wild part about this, I strongly suspect that, if, let's say, healthcare was allowed to the various people across the country, if, let's say, resources were contributed, I wonder whether that rate would have dropped in the way that rate would have dropped. And again, this could be a situation from COVID, making this situation worse. Undoubtedly, COVID will make the situation worse. Shane, what do you think about this? I mean, when we looked abroad and we saw the birth rate in other countries drop, we screamed that it was genocide. How do we deal with this one? What do we make of the 4% drop in our birth rate?
Well, it's not just the birth rate; it's also life expectancy. So people are living shorter lives, and they're having fewer babies, which means there's less life total. Both of which are travesties, in each in their own way. I'm a pro-natal person. There are anti-natalists who think that there should be less people on this planet, and then there are pro-natalists who think there should be more people on this planet, and then there are people who just don't pay attention to it or don't have an opinion or don't know what the right thing is or whatever. I think there should be more people on this planet. I think, technological advancement helps us to use our environment more efficiently and to use it less, to work with it more, to understand it better. That's another conversation, but just getting the sort of groundwork out there. I think there should be more people, and that includes more Americans. The birth rate dropping, no, it doesn't qualify as genocide. You bring up healthcare, you bring up some stuff like that. I would just look at higher wages. If wages, no, but I hear you. But there's a way in which you can make that claim. But no, if wages had continued to go up instead of stagnating for multiple generations at this point, you would see this happening. With COVID, I think that the net result will be less babies. But for a while there, and this may have just been a meme that people were seeing, I saw people having more babies. I saw people being stuck together and being like, well, we're going to be in this room. We're going to be in this room. I know what we're going to do. We're not just going to do the thing that you're thinking, but we're going to use it to have some children. And so I saw people talking about this online, but I don't know if demographically how much that panned out. I can see particularly people getting into new relationships, that would slow down significantly. So if you were in one already, you might be more likely to have a kid, maybe. I'd have to look at the statistics. But if you weren't in a relationship, it's pretty hard to get into one, particularly a physically intimate one, when you're in lockdown and you can't leave your house or go more than 10 kilometers from it, as was the case in France for a while there. So, yeah, I could see it cutting both ways. Anyway, we should have more children, and our children should live longer lives. That's my final take.
Yeah, agreed. The life expectancy thing is fascinating because I don't think this is true in other countries. I think this is specific to the United States. If I'm not mistaken, the countries that have universal health care don't have this issue. This is us. And I think you're right also about, I mean, this is the thing where Rick Santorum, right? It's like these guys care care greatly about God's creation in the womb. And then God's creation gets out of the womb, and sometimes it's not a God creation anymore. And we shouldn't care about it. We shouldn't take care of it. And the state shouldn't have any responsibility in taking care of the kid that we basically said we need you to build and to birth. No. If we care about it in the womb, we should care about it outside of the womb. But that's not what these guys do. The life expectancy going down is getting across something is wrong with our society that is sick. And what I mean by that is, if the other countries around the world are not seeing this drop in life expectancy, then there's something unique about us in the way that we're going about our affairs. And I strongly suggest that is this disease of despair that we were talking about, where these things kind of show themselves in situations where stats like this. I mean, that's a horrible stat. I mean, losing the life expectancy, not just from the standpoint of having babies, but even from the standpoint of the length of time that we're living. Yeah, that's not a good stat. That is not.
It is, and I want to, since we're still, I know we need to close for headlines soon, and since we're having this conversation, you're making the sort of left-wing political argument, which is fine, and it has a place in it, and I'm not trying to be roundly critical of that idea, but it seems to me like the right wing is critical of the status quo because they see a corrupt and overreaching government, and they're right for seeing that. And the left wing of the status quo is critical of what's going on because they see a government that doesn't do nearly enough to help its citizens. And each in its own way seems absolutely appropriate to me. It seems like they're both responding to a dysfunctional government looked at from these different perspectives. They're both looking at the elephant and they're trying, they're blind. They're trying to explain to each other angrily what exactly is wrong with the situation. But they're both in their, one's hand is on the tusk, the other's hand is on its tail, whatever. And maybe up its what, but they're both describing a problematic situation. And what we need to do is have a more functional government that is both not corrupt, not overreaching, and at the same time can fundamentally solve our problems. And that is far, 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 far easier said than done. Yeah. But I feel like if that were the focus, and if there were this sense that, okay, they each have their points, we should stop having all of these stupid arguments over marginal issues that are caused by this problematic government and just focus on improving it. I think things would be better. But hey, I'm a 28-year-old without any political clout. So who am I to say? I understand
your point, but there's a vast difference in regards to the reason and rationale for one versus the other. I mean, even in the way that you described it, the left cares about the fact that the people are not getting X or Y, or that this job is not provided for the person, or that health care is not provided for the person, or that child care. Like the left's perspective of this, and I don't mean the woke left, I mean the real left. Their perspective of this is on the human being and on the individual, and how that human being and individual is being deprived of things that allow for their life. The right doesn't care about that. That's a vast difference. I understand your point when, the issue here is government and a response of government. Yes, that's true. That there is this argument to be made about, government needs to be more efficient, government is corrupt, these guys are putting money in this place and that place, they're glad-handing, etc. And those are arguments that both the left and the right make when they're getting into this notion about corruption in government. But I think the left is specific in its point of saying, look, the human being matters and has value. And for whatever value Rick Santorum ascribes to the baby, we ascribe that to the human being in and of itself and believe that should be prized and taken care of. And so I don't mean take care of in a baby way. I just mean taking care of in the sense of needs.
Maybe it's just that I'm resolutely independent or something like this, and so I just don't want to buy into any of these dichotomies, even where they sometimes would apply. And so I admit that I might be wrong here, but it feels like The right's argument against the left is that it's unthinking. The left's argument against the right is that it's unfeeling, that it doesn't care, that this is a hemispheric bifurcation. This is a deep, and it's not true. They just have different approaches and different complaints. And they're not even, it's not like they're like perfectly mirroring each other. It's not like they're actually matching some fundamental dichotomy in our approaches. The left is weird in its own way. The right is weird in its own way. They're each fragmented in their own ways. I know that some people say that there's no real left wing in the United States. I've heard some people say that there is no real right wing in the United States. They're each like in disagreement with themselves. And I just, I don't.
States. I mean,
I hear you, but some
right. I mean, so there's definitely a right wing. But yeah, we need to close out. So those are your headlines. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We will be back in a moment with the one and only Stephen Bassett. We're going to be talking about the basically the congressional report that's supposed to be coming out on UFOs. But we're also going to be talking about the Department of Defense Inspector General has basically opened up a probe into the handling of UFOs by the Pentagon. Now, this is fascinating, and it makes all the sense in the world. We're going to have a conversation about it with Stephen Bassett. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We will be back in a moment.
Fault Lines. Want to talk? Get in touch with us at radio@sputniknews.com.
Are you bored? Are you lonely? Do you need a hug? Well, we can't give you that, but we can keep you up to date on Radio Sputnik.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined by my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. If you guys live in the area, you can catch us on radio at 105.5 FM and 1390 AM. We're also in Kansas City at 102.9 FM and 104.7 FM. If you guys are digging what Shane and I are putting down, whatever platform you're consuming this content on, give us a like and share that audio or video. If you guys want to join in on the conversation, you can do so with a chat, a tweet, and of course, you can reach us by phone at 202-521-1320. That is 202-521-1320. Your engagement helps make the show what it is, so definitely don't be shy. If you are an individual that's, let's say, working at the Pentagon, and you hear, credibly so, that your airspace, sensitive militaristic airspace, is being invaded by something that you don't know what, that is doing things that we can't compete with, that is transmedium, apparently, meaning going into water, out of water, and having basically the same capabilities of speed and maneuverability, and both blinking out of existence at one point and speeding by at another point. These things are doing things that our pilots are not able to compete with, nor are the various members of the military able to explain. Well, if you are, let's say, the Inspector General, and this becomes very clear from the standpoint of the news reports, from the standpoint of the talks on CNN and whatnot, from the standpoint of the UAP task force saying, yes, those videos are real, those videos are credible. When you have videos released of triangles flying over military ships, when you have reports on either the USS Kidd, the USS Russell, the USS Raphael, you have all of these reports of all of these ships seeing these very strange things that they can't necessarily explain. Your question is very basic and straightforward. How long have you known this? What have you been doing about this? Well, the Inspector General has just basically opened up an inquiry. The Department of Defense Office of the Inspector General has announced a formal evaluation into the Pentagon's actions regarding UFOs. It's logical. Now the catch is, what does it mean? And to discuss what it means, we're joined with Stephen Bassett. He is Executive Director of Paradigm Research Group, PRG, founded in 1996 to end a government-imposed embargo on the truth behind extraterrestrial phenomena. He has spoken to audiences around the world about the implications of disclosure and has given 1,200 radio and television interviews. Stephen, welcome to the show. Thank you for joining us again.
Always my pleasure.
Absolutely. So the Inspector General is looking into basically the Pentagon. And I'll read some of this. According to the memorandum, this was obtained by debrief. The quote, the objective of the evaluation is to determine the extent to which the Department of Defense has taken actions regarding unidentified aerial phenomena. We may revise the objective as the evaluation proceeds, and we will consider suggestions for management for additional revised objectives. I couldn't tell whether this was good or bad. The only thing my thought was, okay, this means that they're taking it seriously now. Like in real world, physical matter reality, there's something that is invading our military installations. There's something that shut off the nuclear weapons. How are you guys not explaining this? Like, that's the way I took this, that the government has started to take this seriously, Congress has started to take this seriously, and this is somewhat of a logical reaction. Also, apparently, this was brought about because of the congressional reports, and they felt like these guys were stonewalling. What are your thoughts about this? Like, how do you take this? How do you frame this, just in your experience?
Interesting question. Think of Kabuki theater with the mask. It's more along those lines than most people think. What's going on is not what it seems. It's much more complicated than that. But a great deal has been happening in the last 3 years, and then in the last months, you've seen an accelerated pace of statements coming forward from high-level officials. The simplest way I can put it, since we have so little time, is this. The U.S. government, meaning those within the government that had a need to know, have known about the fact that there's an extraterrestrial presence since 1947, at the absolute latest. And the phenomena that's referred to as UFOs, now we prefer to call it unidentified aerial phenomena, UAP, has been confirmed and known by them all of this time and been studied continuously for 75 years. So I think your average listener would think, wait a minute, you're saying that the government has known about this for 75 years, but now we're seeing all these things that seem to indicate that, wow, there's something going on here, and we need to look into this.
Maybe, but Stephen, thank you for joining us. But the average listener might also be listening. How do you know what the government knows? What evidence are you bringing to bear? What perspectives have you heard? Why do you say that the government is absolutely aware of not just unidentified flying objects or unidentified aerial phenomena, effectively the same terms, just changed slightly, but that there is an extraterrestrial presence specifically? Where does that come from for you, Steve?
It comes from 75 years of research that's been done by citizen science researchers, right? And there are thousands of books. So if one wants to know, pick 200 or 300 of the best and read them. And that's just the books. If you also want to get a sense of what's been known, and you can actually get a lot from just actual news coverage. Yeah. Read the articles going back to 1947. I've got 12,000 articles on my website that are linked. One could go read those, and that's just a fraction of the ones that have been written. Well, let me be clear. Since you have this wealth of knowledge, if you could marshal some specific examples, or if you could make a specific case, because effectively you're saying, go read several hundred books and then come back to me. If that is the ask for the average listener, I don't see them doing that, and therefore I don't see this cause making any movement. Look, I'm sorry that the average listener doesn't have the ability to research the issue. I get they're busy. Why does the average person think that the statements that the scientific community makes about quantum physics are true? If the average listener has to have that proved to them in a couple of minutes, otherwise they dismiss it, I'm sorry. Look, here's the deal. It doesn't matter what one is comfortable with. The government has known about the extraterrestrial presence is no later than Roswell, the events of Roswell, New Mexico. So what they eventually did, and this is all outlined fantastically well in Richard Dolan's seminal work, the UFOs in the National Security State, Volume 1, Volume 2. Anybody who reads the first 120 pages of that book who is reasonable and intelligent will pretty much conclude, yeah, they've been having to deal with this issue since 47. And so what the government did, and it was put together between 47 and about 53, is they instituted what I have come to refer to as the truth embargo, not the UFO cover-up. And that truth embargo has been in place since then. It's now in its 75th year, meaning that the confirmation of this issue, the acknowledgement of the truth of this matter by the government, would be withheld from the American people for national security reasons. It's not an illegal policy. It is a national security policy. So what in the hell is going on now? What's going on now is that the truth embargo is starting to come apart, finally. The wrappings on the package are coming loose. This is, and the Rubicon, the river that was crossed, the Rubicon that was crossed on this, that started this, what I call inevitable march towards disclosure, which is the formal acknowledgement of the ET presence, capital D disclosure, was October 2017, when the To the Stars Academy, which was an NGO created by people within the Department of Defense to come forward publicly, comprised of former members of the military intelligence complex, who then delivered a major story to the New York Times, and those two stories were published in December 16th, 2017. That moment, the moment those stories hit, was essentially the Rubicon. We weren't going to go back. And for the last 4 years, it was supposed to happen much sooner, but the wrong person won the presidency. For the last 4 years, we've been moving inexorably towards a formal confirmation of the ET presence by the President of the United States. And as this has moved forward, you're starting to see agencies and individuals getting on board, I guess you could say. They're coming out and making statements that, well, you just wouldn't have heard 10 years ago or 15 years ago, whether it's former John Brennan, whether it's David Radcliffe, whether it's John Radcliffe. I mean, David Radcliffe, John Brennan.
Yeah.
Marco Rubio made his move. What is happening now? I know this sounds crazy, but what is literally happening now is a public relations campaign on the part of agencies such as the Navy, such as the Department of Defense, even the Congress, to get out ahead of this issue before the formal confirmation comes due, so that everyone looks as good as possible. But the impression that some people get is, oh, they just discovered there's a phenomena, or they just started investigating it again, or wow, I had no idea. It's all nonsense.
Yeah, well, I mean, and that does seem like kabuki theater. That seems like an appropriate term to use for that. But I wonder if what's behind the kabuki theater is not, again, and this is where I want to come back to this, is not necessarily an extraterrestrial presence, but like top secret government projects undertaken by either the United States government, other governments around the world, or some combination of those two ideas. That they're selectively disclosing for strategic purposes terrestrially. And
no,
the
answer is no.
I think, I don't buy that.
I'm sorry. It's simply no.
Yeah, I don't buy that.
I appreciate your thoughts and I appreciate your theory, but no.
But back it up.
That's not the case.
Back it up.
Well,
Steve,
when Luis Elizondo,
you want me to present you
the
full evidentiary.
Stephen, well, Luis Elizondo was on the show, and Luis Elizondo basically made the point of saying, yes, we have technology from craft. What do you think? You think those were interdimensional fish? Like, what did you think he was talking about? You would have to believe that Bassett, that Elizondo, who is basically doing the project, is lying to you. You would have to believe that all of the military people who have come out who say, yes, I was in the air, I was looking at a craft, are lying to you. So I don't get this weird pushback. About
it's okay to push back, but again, my job here is to come on and tell you what's going on.
Exactly.
It's not to debate the issue with someone who hasn't arrived to that conclusion yet. Everybody gets to figuring out this thing in their own time, and not everybody gets there at the same time. They have different backgrounds. That's okay. My job is not to persuade. My job is to tell you what is going on, right? For your information. Use it, don't care. But let me try to put it this way. The To the Stars Academy was formed because, I believe, the Department of Defense became aware that Secretary of State Hillary Clinton was going to win the White House. And Clinton and her husband, John Podesta, and others were well known to be connected to the ET issue going all the way back to 1993. They are also aware that there had been substantial information out there about that since 2020. So they had already been addressing the issue indirectly. Why? Because Secretary Clinton intended to disclose the ET presence when she became president. Why? Because her husband made an effort to get the files out back in 93 to 95 and was completely stonewalled by his own government, even though that's constitutionally not correct. And then false reports costing millions of dollars were put out about mogul balloons and crash test dummies and everything else. Then they impeached him. And so she was going to do it. Now, I was able to out that situation because I was in Washington and got the issue into play with a number of news organizations, and articles started appearing. They started getting calls from reporters for comments, and they couldn't answer it. So they started going on television and Kimmel show and so forth, and making statements, both Podesta and her, to try to keep things alive.
We know this because of the Clinton leaks. Like this, where she was trying to get Podesta, like the people on the Jimmy Kimmel show to ask her about UFOs. They asked her in the background. They're like, yes, they asked her about UFOs. This was stuff that was released in the Clinton leaks. Please continue.
Yeah. There was some leaks in Wikipedia that showed that something was going on that ultimately ended up being the To the Stars Academy. But they had approached the Clinton team, not the Republicans. So these articles started appearing. They started appearing on television. In other words, these were controlled statements on Jimmy Kimmel and Colbert, in which they knew there was not going to be any confrontation and they could just let it out. There was also some interviews, some tweets. They were carefully managing their connection to the issue without getting too deep because they had no choice. I generated eventually 400 articles about her connection to the ET issue and John Podesta's and her husband's through that campaign. All those are linked on my website. And so they realized that if she wins the presidency and she brings about disclosure, hopefully by holding first congressional hearings, that they were going to be holding the bag, that the Defense Department, the military intelligence complex, were going to be thrown under the bus by the politicians who were not going to take the blame for 75-year truth embargo. They were going to blame the Pentagon. And so they took action. Did I lose you?
No,
Sorry.
You're here. So you believe?
Okay.
Oh,
All
that's
right.
interesting.
They got together inside, and we don't know the origin story exactly, but they decided to take some action, and what ultimately they did was to support from inside the creation of an outside organization, an NGO called the To the Stars Academy, that would be manned. There's one woman. By former high-level careerists within the military intelligence complex, the DoD, the CIA, even a contractor, Lockheed Martin. And this group, no longer employed by the government, would be the one to bring to the New York Times the extraordinary stories that it did, which included the first release of gun camera footage ever by any government ever on the history of this issue. That gun camera footage of the Tic Tac and others. These were game changers, huge step forward. And then they intended to go to the New York, and they were intended to do that after she got elected. But when she didn't get elected, it hung everything up in limbo. What do we do now? Because she's not president, and a new president coming in, we don't know what he knows or is going to do, and the whole thing was rather chaotic. So that is kind of the backstory, right? So what was going on was the Department of Defense, the military intelligence complex, was trying to get ahead of the issue so that if the new president announced the extraterrestrial presence, they would not be thrown under the bus, meaning, hey, it wasn't our fault. My husband wanted to tell the people. Jimmy Carter wanted to tell the people. The Pentagon lied. The Pentagon blocked it. They are the ones, and they were going to have to take the heat. Now, by getting out ahead of it.
You're saying that the IG is basically looking into the Pentagon on some level out of theater? Like that Because I took it a little bit differently. I took it as
it is pretty in one regard. And look, this is actually serious stuff happening.
Right.
I get that, but if you know enough about the issue, you realize that basically it's theater.
Well, I guess what I'm getting at is it possible that one aspect of government doesn't know what the other aspect is doing? Meaning, like, it's not theater in the sense that all of these parties know the issue and everything else, but it's more so theater in the sense that one aspect of government knowing about this other aspect of government that's more in line with the public and is closer to the public is saying, well, wait a minute, what is this issue? Is this a real thing?
That's being generous. Look, this is. There are times when one hand doesn't know what the other hand is doing, but this issue, which is massively important, has been in play for 75 years. Yeah. It just didn't turn up yesterday, and so it essentially, it is theater, right? Now, how in the case of the Inspector General, what's going on there is that Marco Rubio, after he got briefed by some of the witnesses, I imagine that Christopher Mellon is the one that brought those witnesses in front of him. Mellon has been briefing members on the Hill for about 19 months. I don't know if he's doing it now still, but for about 19 months, he was up there briefing key people on the Hill. Why? Well, the reason is that the plan has always been to get congressional hearings. That was the point of it all in the first place. So he briefs Mellon. He briefs Mark Warner, who was the ranking member. Rubio was the chairman of the Senate Intel. This is the key committee. And Rubio decides he would make a move. Right? I don't know if Rubio knows there's an extraterrestrial presence. He's a pretty smart guy. He's been around a long time. I can't imagine he wasn't tipped off. But he makes his move very cleverly by putting some language in the Defense Appropriations Bill calling for a report from certain agencies like the ONI via the UAP task force, which was set up specifically to receive that football when it got passed. And so 880 days from the signing of the bill, very safe. That would be in June because the bill wasn't going to get signed at the end of the year. It was politically safe for Rubio because he wasn't up for election, and the report would finally come down well after the election. But he was on record, and he's since been praised and gotten a lot of press for this effort to get to the truth. Good for him. He did it. Fine. Now, what's happening now with the Inspector General, the machinery is being put in to service that request, which wasn't a legal demand. It wasn't in the enumerated section of the bill. It was in the comment section of the bill. So it was essentially a request from the Senate Intel Committee that you just don't want to ignore. Otherwise, things could get a little testy. That's all right. And so the Inspector General is part of the machinery that's going to put together this report that will come back supposedly in about mid-June. All right. So there's nothing that special about it. But meanwhile, you've got Norquist and Brennan. You've got Woolsey and several others, high-level people that are suddenly getting in the news with statements that, well, there's things we don't fully understand and they're unidentified. You've got Harry Reid, who's near death, who is sort of in a hurry because he knows he doesn't have much time and love to see this resolved before he dies. He's coming out and making statements like, I'm aware that the Lockheed Martin had materials from crash vehicles. Yeah. All right. So, and that made news. You've got news piling on top of news. I can't even keep up with it all. People are trying to get on board as fast as they can because we're almost at the end of this 75-year national security policy that the ETs are not part of this, that somehow it's something else. That's all about to end. Well, when it does, we'll finally get a larger picture of this.
Well, we have about 3 minutes. And I want to get into this notion of what do you think the report is going to say? Because to me, if it's technology, then it's owned by somebody. Meaning if they're seeing technology that is doing miraculous things, then it's owned by somebody. The report doesn't like to get into the notion of what's in it. It only tries to get it tries to, it's this weird thing of trying to assess intent without trying to deal with who controls it. And they do that for obvious reasons. They don't want to freak people out. So fair enough.
The report is not going to prove anything. Right. Look, what's really going on right now, that report is incidental. It's not even that important in a way. What's going on right now is that Mellon was setting up the Congress, preparing the groundwork for congressional hearings. Luis Elizondo was accumulating witnesses, lots of them, military witnesses. Some of them they were on the television show Unidentified. He's been approached by scores of people. So he's been lining up witnesses. Mellon has been preparing the Congress to accept hearings on this. Where we're headed for is the first congressional hearings on this issue since 1968, which was a one-day affair designed to just say, hey, here's something we're doing, now go away. This will be the real deal. It'll go on for days and days. These hearings will be watched by hundreds of millions of people. They have set the groundwork for this. The report was Rubio's maneuver. Now, that report could be a problem if the opponents to ending this truth embargo get a hold of it or get a hold of the agencies involved and somehow we end up getting a platter of nothing burgers. That would be a problem. I don't think that'll happen. But it's not the report that matters, though if it turns up, it will definitely meld in with the hearings quite well. What matters is these hearings, all right? That is what's coming. Watch for the congressional hearings. And the things that are happening are just amazing. There was an article that just appeared a few days ago in the New Yorker by a fairly competent writer by the name of Gideon Lewis Krause. It is the first article on this subject, serious article that wasn't silly, ever in the New Yorker. It is a massive article. And while it has flaws and issues, you read this article, which is long, and you begin to, that can kind of give you a picture of, wait a minute, what's going on here is more than just some people just noticed there was something in the sky. My God, no. What you're seeing is an historic event underway in which the United States government is trying to extricate itself from a 75-year national policy of denying the obvious to the world's people every single day. It's the ultimate lie, totally legal, and they've got to extricate in a way that they look as good as possible. This is a public relations process so that the DoD and the president and the Congress and everybody else doesn't look too awful when the people finally find out that their governments have been lying to them about this issue since the day they were born. That's what's going down, gentlemen, and you will find out soon enough about this. I have given 70 interviews already this year. I'll probably give 70 more in the next couple of months. I'm an activist. My job isn't to sort of slow something out or slow walk it or not step out of line and never say the word extraterrestrial. That's not my job. These people are limited in what they can say. Elizondo is limited. Mellon is limited. I don't have that problem. I'm going to tell you flat out.
Well,
all
the
right.
things
There's
I
an
gotta be
extraterrestrial
honest,
presence.
the things that Elizondo has admitted to has been pretty extreme. I mean, like he's talking about craft, he's talking about materials, he's talking about human effects. Like he is going there. I mean, maybe not necessarily in the interviews that are official, but when he gets out and makes those statements and whatnot, there are logical implications of those statements. And he's not talking about an interdimensional being pulling human. No, he's talking about materials and he's talking about equipment. And so, Stephen, thank you for joining me, man. I really appreciate this. Stephen Bassett is the executive director of Paradigm Research Institute. Well, why do I keep saying that? Paradigm Research Institute, PRG, founded in 1996 to end a government-imposed embargo on the truth behind extraterrestrial-related phenomena. He's spoken to audiences around the world about the implications of disclosure and has given over 1,200 radio and television interviews, apparently over 70 this year. PRG's advocacy work has been extensively covered by national and international media, including and being featured on CNN, Fox News, MSNBC, The Washington Post, New York Times. And Bassett has appeared in many documentary films, and his lectures and interviews are well represented on YouTube. You can find more information about Stephen Bassett on his website at www.peridiumresearchgroup.org and Disclosure Wire podcast at www.disclosurewire.org. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We will be back in a moment.
Fault Lines.
Epidemics and pandemics could kill millions of people, and they actually did. Centuries ago, deadly outbreaks called the Black Death, the Plague of Justinian, and the Spanish flu ravaged countries, empires, and whole continents. Some of these diseases are still present around the globe. Others have become a thing of the past. Discover how these ancient and not so distant outbreaks from previous centuries differ from modern-day SARS, MERS, and coronavirus pandemics. Listen to our new series, Outbreak, the deadliest epidemics in human history, this week on Radio Sputnik.
Fault lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined by my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. There hasn't been much news about it, but Colombia right now has erupted based on a bill, or a regressive tax reform bill, that basically was the straw that broke the camel's back in April 28th. Right now, there have been massive protests over that haven't necessarily been abating over President Ivan Duque's basically neoliberal policy regime. Let's play the clip.
Human rights organizations say the situation in Colombia is beyond dire as security forces unleash violent repression against demonstrators, with national strike mobilizations across the country now on day 8. In press conferences, those human rights defenders have confirmed the validity of the countless videos circulating on social media showing police shooting at gatherings of youth and bloody victims lying on the ground, and with the figure for killings by police approaching 30 as of Tuesday. The actions, first ignited by the Colombian government's neoliberal tax reform bill, which were called by labor unions and social movements, achieved a partial victory with the withdrawal of the legislation announced by President Ivan Duque on Sunday. The Minister of Finance and his vice minister behind the bill also resigned, but social movements in the streets immediately read this as an attempt to demobilize protest. And last night, Duque made what appeared to be yet another attempt to pacify the country.
I would like to announce that we will open a space to listen to citizens and build solutions oriented to these purposes.
The president said that security forces would be guaranteeing food and supply deliveries and ensuring public services, despite the strike actions affecting movement on roads and highways. But his declarations went on to justify continued militarization and the excessive use of force by police and military.
This is the time to fight, united, against violence, to exemplarily punish the criminals who have articulated actions against citizens. We will never stop acting against crime and violence.
I spoke by phone to campesino leader Ernesto Roa in Arauca. He's the president of the National Agrarian Coordinator of Colombia, and I spoke to him after unions and social movements made the call to maintain the national strike. His organization is an indigenous and Afro-Campesino organization that works for the defense and recovery of Colombia's rural areas.
This bad government needs to go. So we are now going to strengthen the strikes in the different regions. As campesinos, we have demanded the integral and democratic agrarian reform. We continue to raise the historical demands of campesinos, which are the immediate surrender of land for the production of food due to the deficit we have here. We're also demanding that they stop the attempt to renew aerial fumigation. Instead of countering the crops, the only thing that's done is to poison the environment, the roads and territories. We have also demanded that they stop the genocide that is being committed against any social expression, and in our case, to stop the assassinations of campesino leaders that have been taking place, as well as the criminalization and imprisonment of our leaders.
Citizens will be pouring into the streets today once again for a day of action and mass demonstrations called by the main labor unions which form the National Strike Committee.
The voice that you guys were listening to is Camila Escalante. She's a TV producer and presenter at Telesur English who works with Kashwan News. Camila, thank you for joining us on this one. The mainstream media hasn't necessarily been covering this in the United States. I've been following it basically on social media. I have a lot of people who basically follow news in South America, you being one of them, and you being one of the more phenomenal ones. It seems that the government, Duque's government, wanted to balance some of the difficulties they were having with COVID and the shortages on the backs of basically labor, and that the public basically responded. What is going on right now in Colombia? I mean, the video was a great snapshot. Can you frame this for us in regards to what is taking place there right now?
Yeah, well, like I said, today is the 8th day of national strike mobilizations in the country. And they actually called for on Monday, the labor unions. There are 4 major unions that make up the National Strike Committee. They sat down and had a press conference on Monday, which was the day after Duque said that he would withdraw the tax bill. And they said that the mobilizations are going to continue. And of course, in some ways, the unions represent an even more, moderate section of the social sectors. There are even more social movements who also told their militancy that we're going to remain out on the streets and we're going to continue to make our demands. So those unions themselves said that there's going to be a day of national mobilizations today in particular. And the different social movements have also said that now we need to respond to the killings and the violence by the security forces. So now they're making a whole lot of other demands as well. And so we'll continue to see the mobilizations over the next, who knows how long. And they're demanding things such as, in the case of the campesino leader we heard from in my report, they're demanding things like the resignation outright of Duque and his cabinet. But others are making demands, regarding other issues concerning both urban and rural communities.
And this is Camila. Thank you for joining us, and thank you for that great report. Duque has said that he's rolling back these proposals, like we mentioned. This is also coming. This is worth pointing out. Colombia's economy took almost 7% hit. It contracted almost 7%, 6.8% over the course of last year. So serious economic hardship. I'm guessing that this is a new crisis, but it's also partly an extension of ongoing economic problems in the country. What exactly was in the bill that people really didn't like, and what is being proposed as an alternative? As again, Colombia's economy is not in a good state right now. They need to change some of their spending patterns. What is the sort of alternative that groups representing the protesters are trying to solve this problem from their side, from their perspective? What are they recommending? Camila.
Yeah, absolutely. So they were saying that the taxes would disproportionately, of course, affect people who already haven't had enough to eat, who already are suffering from mass unemployment and underemployment, young people who have been out on the streets and aren't working, and an already informal economy, as we've talked about, in previous reports about how things have been going under COVID in Latin America, where we have a lot of people who just go out and sell candy and things like that in order to make money. And so what Duque said, he said this last week when the protests were beginning, and he also said on Sunday that they're going to just go back and consult with, different parties and try to renegotiate this bill and just present another similar one. And so this is another one of the demands of the different social sectors, is they say that that they're not consulting with the people that it most affects, and that that politics can't continue as such.
Basically, they're going to just refashion the bill and put it back in basically the same form. I'm curious, what has been Duque's response? Meaning from the standpoint, Duque's response from the standpoint of the militarization. I've seen tanks rolling into communities at this point. I mean, it seems like he's either hasn't necessarily declared martial law yet, but in some areas it seems that he has declared martial law. What are your thoughts on this? I mean, can you describe the kind of the havoc that has been raining down on the citizens in Colombia in their pushback against the government?
Yeah, in the city of Cali, they have relieved the civil authorities of their responsibilities and have instead installed the military and police. And they have not called at this point, to my knowledge, a state of exception in the different areas. But if they do, it'll be a different situation that social movement leaders have feared. And they have in Cali specifically, where what's been going on has been called a murder. They have instituted a curfew to try to keep people from protesting throughout the night after 8 p.m. But yeah, like you said, places have been highly militarized. That was ordered on the weekend. It's just in different areas as well. It's the case where police and military have the authority. And this is, of course, because this is a government that has worked in very close coordination and close partnership with the United States and its different agencies, as well as the U.S. military, advising Colombia very closely on anti-drug policy over a period of years.
Camilla, I'm going to have to step in. I always hate doing that, but we're coming to the edge of the hour. Look, great report. I really do appreciate it. A phenomenal explanation of this in the story. So the voice that you guys were listening to is Camilla Escalante. She's a TV producer and presenter at Telesur English, who also work as Kashwan News. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We'll be back in a moment.
Listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Fault Lines.
Live from across the divided states of America, it is now time for the last hour this morning of the most disruptive show, covering news, events, and politics from across these divided states and across the surface of our increasingly fragmented globe. In the independent corner, I'm your political analyst, Shane Stranahan.
And in the left corner, I am the indefatigable, the last man on the wall, your political analyst, Jamarl Thomas.
And together we are Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. All right. Good morning, everybody. Whether you're just joining us or you've been with us for the whole thing, I hope you're having a good one. I want to give folks a quick overview of today's show so far. At 7:30 a.m. Eastern, we spoke with Peter Oliver, EU correspondent for RT International, about the European Union's fragmented attempts. As different countries are trying to reopen, other countries don't want to reopen, specifically the borders between these countries in the Schengen zone, the inter-European Union travel bloc. He was describing how plenty of his neighbors, it seems like everybody wants to go on a trip to Barcelona, Spain, or Mallorca, or just different areas. And, this is coming as Germany is seeing an accelerating vaccine response, upwards of 1 million doses administered the other day. And this is, again, a pretty darn high number. If you compare this to the United States, we have been celebrating our vaccine peak about 3 weeks ago. In the last week, we've dropped since then, but we've seen almost 1 million doses delivered on average per day. This is with a population approximately 4 times the size of Germany's. So for Germany to get 1 million doses out in a single day, that's over 4 times the rate that the United States has seen recently. That is a feat. And this is, coming as other countries in the European Union are also having some success. Other countries, however, in the bloc are not. And so there's a sort of political battle over whether or not to reopen, to what extent you're going to reopen travel within the bloc. Interesting conversation with Peter Oliver. Also talked about the AstraZeneca and his health, which is good, apparently. It's you know what? I'll put it like this. He said he hadn't seen his family in a year and a half, since December of 2019. That's quite a while. I've technically living with family, helping to support a house out here, but it's been about a year now, almost a year since I've seen my mom. I miss him. I miss these people, and he's gone quite a bit longer, so I can only empathize with that. And of course, that's just a small sort of miniature version of what a lot of people are dealing with. As due to mandated lockdowns, families have been split apart. People are being, effectively stuck indoors, unable to date. I know that one. It's hitting people. Anyway, that was from 7:30 to 8 a.m. Eastern this morning. From 8:15 to 8:45 this morning, we spoke with Steve Bassett in I don't even know if I would call it a contentious interview. At a certain point, I just cut out because, and we can go over this more a little bit later, whenever, Jamarl. But it's like, if I'm asking for some evidence, if I'm asking, I don't need to dominate the conversation with him trying to prove to me that this stuff is extraterrestrial. But he referenced, you'd need to, if you've read upwards of 1,000 books, even if you've read a couple hundred books, then you'll be qualified, effectively, this is the implication, then you'll be qualified to speak about this with me. But I would think, if you've read over 1,000 books on this subject, if you've read tens of thousands of articles or thousands of articles, whatever, you could give me some examples. You could make a compelling case. You could marshal an argument. I don't need him to prove it to me because I don't know exactly what that would take.
But that's
just
basically what you're asking him. Prove on the radio of your belief in extraterrestrials. And I mean,
give me something. Give me something. He didn't give me anything.
But how does he do that, Shane? How does he do that? What were you looking for? Like, what do you need? You need him to bring you the bone of an extraterrestrial and mail it to you? No. What do you need from him? Literally an argument. Literally like a 2-minute argument. That after this event, we saw this response. Oh, yeah, okay. I want something. I want more. He literally was just pushing back anyway. Well, he can give he can give you a specific book. He can tell you about this or that. But then there would be the secondary thing of, okay, well, how does that prove this or that? Like, there's nothing that he could say to you on the radio to prove anything to you about pretty much anything. So it's like the question that seems like a cartoon. That seems like a cartoonish portrayal. I don't want a 6-hour dissertation. That is literal.
I understand.
How does he prove it? That's what I'm asking.
We have 30 minutes with him, and we have 30 minutes with him. I'm not trying to dominate the conversation by like taking the entire time, grilling him, being like, I need more, Stephen. I wanted something, and instead he was dismissive, and that wasn't convincing. It was the opposite.
No, he wasn't dismissive. He's making the same point that I'm making. What do you need of him for him to prove what he said? And not to mention, he's not even here for that. He's here to talk about the task force stuff that's taking place in regards to what they're bringing down for the information or the IG.
Yeah, but he started it out by making a pretty strong claim, which is, without a doubt in his mind, this is an extraterrestrial presence. I wanted something to back that up, and he didn't give me a thing.
So because again, there's nothing that he could give you for that. That's the point that I'm trying to make to you. So when Lou Elizondo was on the show,
but if there's nothing he can give me for it, if he can't prove it to me,
that the evidence is not there. I'm saying there's nothing he could give you for that. When Lou Elizondo, when he was on the show, and Lou Elizondo made the point of saying, yes, we have materials. Now, either Lou is lying, or your next thing is, okay, Lou, I need you to mail me those materials in order to prove me that. So either you accept Lou.
I don't need him to mail them to me. You want Lou to say more than he said.
Yes.
I wanted Stephen to say anything. That's the thing. I wanted Stephen to give me.
I guess the point that I'm getting to you is, where do you think those materials that Lou is talking about came from? Like, do you believe Lou?
I would like to know.
To you? Because I'm saying that these two things are related to one another.
Okay, but Jamarl, you know what? We're in pre-headline, so I don't want to get cut up on this too long. I feel like I've already said my piece here. I want to keep giving a description of the show. We spoke with Steve. Slightly contentious conversation from 8:15 to 8:45, but he gave his perspective. He gave quite a bit of info about what he sees coming here. From 8:45 to 9 a.m., we just finished up a conversation with Camila Escalante, a special report from Camila on the ongoing protests in Colombia, which I don't even know that we hit this particularly, but there was like a massacre. That's how some people are describing it on Monday. The numbers are not out yet on how many people were killed or injured, but it seems like Monday was the worst day yet, in the 8th day straight of protests that started mid last week. Later on this hour, we're planning on speaking with Mark Frost, economics professor and entrepreneur, among many other things. We're going to be talking about the housing market as housing prices see what I might call a bubble, but we'll see if it actually is one. As housing prices are going through the roof, as mortgage rates are at all-time lows, we're going to be talking about that, as well as what reserve currencies exactly are, what the United States dollar's status as a reserve currency does to its value, it might touch on how that plays into geopolitics, but really we're going to be talking about the economics of it. Just an interesting topic that, again, we've been kind of hinting at both of these, hitting them in different ways, either with callers or just in conversations between ourselves for the last couple of weeks. It'll be good to have that. Anyway, that is today's show in a summary format. But without further ado, let's get to the headlines. First up in COVID news, there are at least 40,531 new COVID cases reported in the United States yesterday, with 890 new deaths. Over the past week, there has been an average of 48,000 cases per day. That's a decrease of 26% from the average 2 weeks earlier. 32% of the American public has been fully vaccinated, and 45% of residents have received at least one dose so far. As of this morning, the coronavirus has infected more than 32,539,000 people across the United States and killed about 578,000 people. This comes as yesterday, President Biden set the goal of at least partially vaccinating 70% of adult Americans by July 4th, saying that his administration is going to make it easier than ever to get vaccinated, quote unquote. So far, about 145 million adults, that's 56% of the adult population here in the States, has received at least one dose of a COVID vaccine, with almost 1 million adults being added to that total for each day of the last week. Although the total rate of vaccinations has actually slowed since its peak 3 weeks ago. But it can keep on slowing. The 70% mark, we're most of the way there. And that's about 2 months away at this point. So it can continue to go down. The vaccination rate can continue to go down by a bit, and we'll still make that mark. It sounds ambitious, but it actually doesn't seem that ambitious to me. That seems kind of par for the course that we've been setting so far, which, as far as I can tell, has been a good one. You compare it to Germany, I believe their numbers were 8% of the adult population, or 8% of the population fully vaccinated. That's like 1/4 the amount that we're seeing in the United States, with 32% of the American public fully vaccinated at this point. Anyway, back to our next headline. Lawyers in Australia launched a legal challenge against the Australian government as it has banned the return of Australian citizens from India, which is facing a steep second wave as it regularly sees more than 300,000 new COVID cases per day. The Australian government has threatened to charge anyone who steps foot in Australia within 14 days of being in India with up to 5 years in prison and upwards of 66,000 Australian dollars or 50,000 American dollars in fines. This comes as lawyers for a 73-year-old man named Gary Newman brought the case. There are currently over 9,000 Australian citizens living in India. And no, this is not the same Gary Newman that was like the English new wave singer, artist, whatever. It's a completely different guy. Just to be clear, just to make sure everybody's set straight on that one. Anyway, in national political news here in the States, former President Trump has launched a new service with which he can post his thoughts in a short format. This follows his ban earlier this year from Facebook and Twitter. It also comes as Facebook is today set to announce a decision from an outside advisory council on whether Trump will be allowed to return to the social media platform, if he wants to, that is. This new timeline /blog for Trump can be accessed, by the way, by going to donaldjtrump.com/desk. And it kind of is like, it's not a social media network by any means. It's really just like a tweet length blog format thing that he can post to so his followers can follow him. Or, even if you're not a follower of his, if you just miss the presence of Trump, sort of, gratifying weird tweets that he'd put out with exclamation marks and lots of capitalization and stuff, you can check it out there. Anyway. Oh, yes. And Jamarl, you just put this. Facebook is maintaining its ban against Trump. Thank you for putting that in place. Relevant to this headline. The outside advisory council has apparently said, no, let's keep him off the platform, which, I broadly disagree with. Not just as a former president, but just as a sort of general policy in American politics. Let people speak. Let the people communicate with each other. In 2020, the United States birth rate dropped by its largest margin in over 50 years. The CDC said that 3.6 million babies were born in the U.S. last year, showing that the birth rate dropped 4% compared to the year before. In international news, foreign ministers for the G7 group are reconvening in London for their last day of talks, looking at the global distribution of the coronavirus. The Indian delegation is self-isolating during those meetings. And again, this is coming as India sees a steep second wave, continues to have hospitals over capacity, getting some help from international donors, whether they're countries or nonprofits, with oxygen coming in, medical supplies coming in, vaccines coming in. But it's limited. India is a large country, clearly, with the world's second largest population by an inch, just behind China, just under 3.4 billion residents. And the concern, of course, is that this will continue to spiral out of control. Anyway, in a region just to the east of there, the Philippines has told its fishing fleet to continue working in a disputed region of the South China Sea, which has been restricted since 1999. Restricted in order to preserve fish stocks, by the way, with the South China Sea Task Force of the Philippines saying that this, quote, fishing ban does not apply to our fishermen, end quote. This follows and is a part of heightened tensions between Philippines and China after China has allegedly repeatedly moved its ships into maritime regions under the control of the Philippine government. Myanmar's national unity government, set up in opposition to the current junta, has formed a military organization called the People's Defense Force, quote unquote, which it says it will use to protect its supporters. This move is said to precede the creation of a federal union army, which the national unity government says it intends to use to, quote, make effective reforms in the security sector in order to terminate the 70-year-long civil war, end quote. That war has riddled the country for multiple generations, and a big thing to be curious here, something to be watching, is how the different armed ethnic minority groups in the country that have been parties to that 70-year-long civil war, by the way, which side they're going to back. It seems like of the sides they're going to back the opposition, the national unity government. Seems to me, a layman observer, like they're more likely to back that. But it'd be good to talk with an expert. We have a couple. I want to bring at least one of them on soon to talk about this. In England, a North Korean defector has announced her run for office in England. Ji-yoon Park, who fled North Korea twice and has since moved to England, is running as a conservative in Bury. That is a town in the greater Manchester area in sort of central northern England. And in Colombia, we spoke about this earlier with Camila Escalante, the mayor of the capital of Colombia, Bogota, has requested the military to get involved as protests now stretch into their eighth day straight. This follows a set of bloody events on Monday, which has been called by some a massacre, although the number of deaths and injuries from that day has not yet come out. The protests started on April 28th in opposition to tax reform measures that protesters see as protecting the rich and hitting the working class, in which the government has painted as a necessary way to pay for the expensive wake of the coronavirus, with Colombia's economy getting hit almost a 7% contraction last year due to the effects of the coronavirus there. Anyway, those are our headlines. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We're going into a break. We'll be back in a minute with Mark Frost, economics professor and entrepreneur, talking about the state of the housing market in the U.S. You're listening to Fault Lines. Be right back.
Fault Lines. 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. We give you the most essential information out there. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold. By Any Means Necessary is your guide to the movement and efforts shaping the world around us, from mass incarceration.
No longer am I interested in or concerned with prison reform. I am interested only in the eradication of prisons.
To the battle between police and water protectors.
It was a pretty punishing disregard for the sanctity of human life, that unleashing water cannons on peaceful, prayerful water protectors.
From efforts to protect the environment.
The climate movement is ready to, with plenty of opposition research and force and strength, along with, the right of both science and morality, to fight them on this.
To the movement for Black Lives.
When I first saw the Michael Brown video, and I saw that it clearly contradicted the narrative put forth by the Ferguson Police Department and by police supporters in general, 3 words came to mind: color me shocked.
Stay tuned to By Any Means Necessary, 5 days a week here on Radio Sputnik. Fault Lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan, and we are talking about the housing market with our guest, Mark Frost, joining us now. Mark Frost, for those listening, is an entrepreneur, economist, professor, consultant, a drummer, an Eagle Scout, a Marine, a capitalist, a Schumpeterian, and a recovering libertarian. Mark, thank you for joining us this morning. How are you doing?
Good morning. I'm actually doing pretty good. I got my first vaccination last week. No side effects, except I have 50% energy. That's the only thing I can tell is going on with me, but just kind of tired.
Interesting. And that seems, you say you got it last week. How many, I don't mean to be too personal, but approximately how many days ago?
Tuesday of last week, yeah.
Oh man, and it's over a week later and you're still feeling low on energy. I'm sorry to hear that. I'm young, but I had no side effects, nothing like that. Literally nothing, like slight pain in my arm, and I think that was it.
Yeah, it didn't even start until a week after I got the vaccination. I don't feel bad. I just don't feel there's a heaviness in my step, maybe is a way to put it. I can still work, function, think. It's just there's that feeling of like there's a weight on you or something. But it's getting much better. Rough. Today I feel much better than yesterday.
Good to hear. Good to hear. You sound well enough. And thank you, despite that. Thank you for being willing to join us. All right, let's talk about the housing market. We had a caller call in the other day. I believe it was Brave from Atlanta, talking about the insane housing market that we're dealing with right now. I'm not looking for a house personally. Never have. Mostly when I've done lookups, it's been like looking at the prices of land in random parts of the country. And I'm talking land, not houses, just because I'm curious about that stuff. But if you look, and it's easy to do, you'll see housing prices are insane right now. I wanted to turn to you to talk about this. What exactly is going on here? Low mortgage rates. Why is that happening? And the price of houses going up. What's happening here? Is this a bubble? How do you see this, Mark?
Sure. I have a lot of thoughts on that. Real quick, I just want to say for your viewers how unique this show actually is. Because a lot of people, I don't think, really know the inside, sort of operations and that sort of a thing on it. But I've done CNN, MSNBC, countless radio shows. And I've done your guys' show at least a couple dozen times. And not once has a producer screened what I was going to say before I said it. And there's all this accusations by the mainstream media about, don't listen to Sputnik, don't do that. They're Russian agents and all this kind of stuff. Never. Even one time, even indirectly, has any producer, star, anything like that, tried to mold what I would say on the air. And I think your guys' show is the only one I can say that about. So really? I think you ought to be really proud of what you produced.
That is high praise. Thank you for that. I want to get to the topic here, but no, that is thank you for that. That is high praise. And you're right. It wouldn't be good for the show if we were to do that, because I want to hear your take, whether we agree with you and disagree with you, whatever. It makes for a more interesting conversation. But when it's genuine.
And
anyway.
I watch the show too, not always live, but I try to catch it on YouTube and the website. So kind of between those two, I get 80%. I think of your material. So
that's awesome.
So anyway,
thank you for saying.
Back to the housing market, and I think you also, and it does relate. You also wanted to talk about the dollar as the reserve currency, right?
Absolutely. Yep.
Okay. Well, let's talk about the real estate first, and because that will be a perfect tangent into the Fed. So yeah, the market in Atlanta. Let me say it differently. There are particular markets in Atlanta that the greater Atlanta area that are just smoking hot. And they tend to be the suburbs. There is a mass migration out of Atlanta. I'm one of those people. So, and I think it's the pandemic that did a lot of it. Not just workers figured out, I don't actually have to commute through stressful, 40 minutes of traffic every day. Most of what I need to do, maybe I only need to go to the office actually once per week or twice per week, but I don't have to have this 8 to 5 schedule. I can do it differently. Businesses are thinking, our own business, we give people completely now, we're completely online. So other than people that actually have to go to the place of business and install the payment systems, all of our employees can work from home. It's their option. We have an office. If they want to come to an office, they can come to the office. They might be alone, but we have a little office, but we're probably going to get rid of that office. It just seems completely unnecessary. So we'll be a business without an office, without a formal centralized office. We'll just have a bunch of little sub offices. So keep that in mind. So you have this demand side phenomena where people during the shutdowns, during the pandemic, have asked themselves, they're like, okay, do I really like urban living? And a lot of people have said, yes, I have to be around the nightlife. I have to be around this and that. Other people have said, you know what? I can sell my little expensive plot of land with a shack on it in Atlanta for $500,000, move an hour north and have an acre of land with trees and beautiful lakes and hiking and all sorts of lifestyle type things. So just to use an example, I moved where I'm at almost a year ago, I believe. And there's what I thought was a teardown house, and it probably is. The house looks like it's about 80 years old. It's in bad shape. I don't even think it's livable. When I moved there, they were asking, I believe, $95,000 for it. That's how bad the house was. It just sold for $200,000. Obviously, someone's going to tear it down and build whatever they want on it. But that's
you're saying that was a year ago. You're saying that's a year ago. So yeah, I don't want to use
roughly 90,000, and then it just sold last month. Less
more than double that.
So it doubled in price within a year. Now that's unusual. That's not going to be the average, but it is an anecdotal example from my own life that I see in this market. And I think we're going to see a lot more of that, depending on kind of how the big employers in downtown Atlanta decide to do their thing. Because, if you like nightlife like I am, and I'm an extrovert, it's cheaper to take an Uber to Atlanta anytime you want to party than it is to live in Atlanta. And especially when people start having kids and they start thinking, I'd like to have a backyard. I'd like to have this or that. And I believe we've had a fundamental change in demand on real estate. And the media tends to focus on the supply side. And the big driver of this, in my opinion, really is consumers. Consumers have rethought out their lives, and they've decided, at least in large pockets of home buying consumers, that what they've traditionally looked for in a home is changing.
So you think COVID was the thing that brought about this change? That basically, because the value...
I don't think it... I think... I'm sorry. I didn't mean to interrupt you. I apologize.
No, you're fine. And by the way, thank you for your comments about the show. Honestly, I really appreciate it. Sure. Shane and I try to be honest actors when we go about our affairs. And so, whatever our takes are, they're our takes. There's nothing pushing behind it. So, no, I appreciate that, honestly. I guess what I'm getting at, what's the push in the value of a house? Like, why is it going so high? My mom, for example, my grandmother just passed. And the house has all sorts of problems with it and everything else. The guy said, I buy it from you outright. Meaning the people who were working with her, I forget, for something, also did houses and bought the house outright. Like, it's my wife's brother-in-law. Same thing. He's looking for a house. And he gets to the point where the houses kept going up in value, so much so that people were buying houses without even seeing the house, like without even doing inspections of the house. What is causing the push in value like this? Because it seems significant, and it seems, and I get you saying that people are changing their lifestyles. Is this a response to COVID, where people, let's say, okay, well, I'm working from home now, and maybe in working from home, I don't need to be in the city, or I'm working in a different way now, where for whatever particular reason, my lifestyle has changed in some way. But what brought about the lifestyle change if it wasn't COVID? What am I missing with this? What's pushing up the value of all of these houses and properties? Is it just interests of people have changed?
Two things. First, probably, is that it isn't really COVID itself. It was the forced shutdowns in a lot of areas. So, because people, had we had COVID and had a different policy response, and no government shut down,
that's fair.
I don't think this phenomenon would still be happening.
Yeah, that's fair.
So I think it was the forced shutdowns which forced people to step off of the hamster wheel, and they reassessed what they actually want in life. The biggest problem everybody has in their life is, what gives me meaning? How do I find meaning in my life? It's a different answer for different personalities, different people, but it is the same question most thinking people ask themselves periodically through their lives. And it's not uncommon to be a successful 20-something person, make it into your 30s, and then have a little midlife crisis. Okay, yeah, I have a job and I do this and I do that, but I don't really feel like something's wrong in my life. And I think it was an existential moment that happened collectively with millions of people at the same time that drove this demand function, because it's not real estate everywhere. There's places in Atlanta that if you bought $1 million home and you want to sell it, you need liquidity now, you're going to take $800,000. The media doesn't cover that a lot. They cover the exaggerated cases, and they're saying, oh, look what here. You have
interesting. And so wait, Mark, I want to pause on that for a second. And you got into this earlier, but what you're saying is that from what you've seen locally in Atlanta, but the presumption is this would extend throughout the nation. It is certain types of houses in certain neighborhoods, for instance, a little bit further out from the city center, where people, because they've gotten used to working from home, and there's some expectation that trend is going to continue. They're going to keep working from home. A lot of them, they don't need to be in the city. And so it's not even the suburbs at this point. It's a little bit further out where, they're within driving distance, convenient driving distance of whatever city they probably live nearby. But they can be further out because that's for trips. That's not for getting to and from their job. Is that broadly the point you're making?
Yes, it is. And what a lot of people aren't talking about is how that is going to re-stratify neighborhoods. So, for instance, where I moved, I don't want to call it poor, but it's not wealthy, fancy construction. The zoning is weak. It's not rural in the sense that you're out in the boondocks, but you're not really in even a normal, close to city central type suburb. You'll be driving along and see a super modern house, and then the house next door is a mobile home. So these neighborhoods are changing because what I see just since I've lived here is we're having these 30-somethings and 40-somethings move into an area of Georgia that ordinarily was kind of, not very stratified in the sense that these little communities, people their parents grew up here, their grandparents grew up here, they grew up here. Now all of a sudden you're having this new blood move to these new communities, and it's transforming them.
Interesting.
And I find that, I think the story in 5 years is going to be maybe the suburbs flip. Suburbs have, for instance, suburbs have historically been red states, right? Not states. They've been red areas, generally speaking. There's exceptions. I think that very well might change because people are moving up to where I live, and they have values kind of like mine, not necessarily values like Bubba next door. So you have this educated class, successful class of people moving out of Atlanta, moving into the far outer suburbs. And in some cases, they're not even moving into the formal suburb. They're moving into the outskirts of the suburb, and they really have a rural sort of lifestyle. I mean, if you
that is very interesting. I can see, Mark, we need to go into a break, and there's enough to talk about on the other side. That I'm going to pivot when we come back. But that makes sense, and that's a very interesting outlook. And thank you for bringing us that one. We're going to have to go into a break, though. We are joined by Mark Frost, among other things. He is an entrepreneur and an economics professor. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We will be back with Mark on the other side of this short break.
Fault Lines. Tough questions are the most powerful weapon we have. As long as you have questions, we'll keep asking. Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Stuck in traffic? No problem. Stay informed. Stay tuned to Radio Sputnik on 105.5 FM or 1390 AM in the Washington, D.C. area. Need more? Follow us on Facebook or check us out on SputnikNews.com.
And we are back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan, and we continue to be joined by Mark Frost. He's an entrepreneur, economist, professor, consultant, drummer, an Eagle Scout Marine, a capitalist, a Schumpeterian, and a recovering libertarian. Mark, thank you again for being with us. I'm going to pivot here like I said I would. We're now talking about the U.S. dollar as a reserve currency. You mentioned, and I want to go back to this, two things actually. For one thing, just briefly, you were working in trade in Indonesia. That's where you did your dissertation, right? It might seem far afield, but that's something like that, right?
Yeah, I actually lived in a village with a poor family in their little hut with them for about 4 months. And I speak the language. I know the country very well. I backpacked across it. It's a dear love of mine. It's the most insane. It's the most magnificently insane country I've ever been to. People either love it or hate it. I love it. So
that's very. And you were, and just to put a point on this, and I'll tie this in. But you were doing economics work again on trade there, right?
Yes. Well, more specifically on development, which obviously means they wanted to figure out ways to how do we do more trade, because at that time I was there, that would have been, let's see, 98 or 99, and at that time it was 22,000 rupiah per dollar. Excuse me, when I got there it was about 2,500 rupiah per dollar. 6 months later it was 22,500 rupiah per dollar. They had a massive crash, and there was riots in the street. It was a scary time to be anyone that looked like an American.
I can see that potentially being the case. Yeah. Crazy inflation, which we haven't had to deal with anything like that in the States, and so it's out of our sort of sphere of understanding. Okay, so this is why I was asking. It doesn't tie in quite as well as I was hoping, but it kind of does. The status of the United States dollar as a reserve currency, where I tend to take this, and I want to get your explanation briefly of what a reserve currency is, how it affects the value of that currency and other currencies around the world, and how it affects the economy of the country that has its currency as the predominant world reserve. I usually take this to trade, and specifically manufacturing. How the status of the United States dollar as the world reserve currency, the main one, effectively disincentivizes local manufacturing for foreign export and for domestic consumption too, because it effectively drives the prices of goods up. We can come back to that maybe. That's usually where I take it, and so I want to come back there at some point. But can you just briefly explain what is a reserve currency? How does it affect the currency that is the reserve currency, and how does it affect other currencies around the world, and how does it affect the economy, most importantly, of the country, specifically the United States in our case, that is the reserve? All these things, starting with the first, Mark, what is a reserve currency?
Sure. A reserve currency is just a currency that is the default currency that the participants of the game have revealed their preferences as to what they prefer. So the reserve browser is probably Google. That's what most people use. That sort of a thing. There's no in an anarchy of nations, there's no law that says you have to use the U.S. dollar. And where I think a lot of analysis fails, I think, in this, is they don't go back into history and understand why. And for your listeners, if they want to go research something, I'm a big fan of the theory of hegemonic stability. And the crown sterling was once the world's reserve currency until World War I, when the British bankrupted themselves or began their bankruptcy, you might say. And the United States really started. I mean, if you really want to look at when the dollar started to emerge, I have a date for you. It's December 23rd, 1913. That was the establishment of the Federal Reserve. And it's important for your listeners to realize before that date, the U.S. government did not issue money. Money was issued by private banks. So each dollar issued would have that bank's name on it. So in my office, I like to collect old Federal Reserve banknotes. So I have the Bank of Wichita Falls, $10. Each bank issued its own notes. One of the problems for that was if you don't understand the bank, right? If you're not aware of the Bank of Wichita Falls and you're in San Francisco at some bank that's not aware of that bank, to get your money is more difficult. There's a transaction cost in there. Sometimes you'd have to take less than par value. And then there were all the panics in the late 1800s, specifically 1907. And so the Wilson administration, motivated by a very brilliant man by the name of Mariner Eccles, started looking at, they formed the Federal Reserve. And for the first sustained time, the very first time, the United States itself monopolized the issue of money. So the federal government itself, through the Federal Reserve, started issuing money. And by doing that, they took the country off of the gold standard. Before, if we bought a bunch of stuff from England, we had to pay for it with gold or sterling. That was very important. Then flash forward to World War II, 1946. The world, the developed world was in shambles. They were bombed. And, other than Pearl Harbor, the United States did not suffer the high cost of war. And so we were the last man standing. We had a Federal Reserve that no longer had to respect the price of gold. Well, if you just did a graph of the price of gold from, say, 1800 to today, you'll see that it's flat, $20.50 for decades. And then suddenly, 1913, price of gold just starts skyrocketing. Well, that's the nature of what we built. Then after 1946, we were the last man standing, and let's call it what it is. We forced the Bretton Woods Agreement onto the world. If you wanted to be part of the Marshall Plan, you joined Bretton Woods. Bretton Woods crowned basically the dollar as the reserve currency between those participant nations. And the United States benefited from that because if you have an external demand for your money, for instance, even today, there's more dollars outside of the United States than there are in the United States because every central bank on earth has dollars. It's traditionally been considered the same as gold. And what a lot of people don't know is we got most of the United Kingdom's gold. We got most of the gold of all of our allies in World War II. We would send them ships. We would send them all this stuff. And even though
that is a weird. Yeah, I was. It felt almost like a tangent to bring that up, but you're talking about the gold standard. That is an absolute fact, and it's just an interesting thing. Just briefly on that, what does that mean? Why is that relevant? Why did we bring in to sort of keep safe? That was the argument. So much of their gold is the fear that the Nazis would take it, and what effects has that had?
It had nothing to do, in my opinion, with that the Nazis would take it. It had everything to do with the fact that at that particular time, some very smart people understood that the United States was in a new era of its history. And just like the theory of hegemonic stability would predict that a United Kingdom would be the world's hegemon. Likewise, after 1913 and World War I, because people forget how much money was spent by the European powers on World War I, we sort of played in it as a hobby. I'm not wanting to dismiss the people who lost their lives in it, but we did not go to war in the way that the Europeans went to war in World War I. We just didn't. Even in World War II, we didn't suffer the costs of war like the Europeans did. So Europe was just in shambles. It was economically hammered. It was difficult to buy a washing machine in 1946 in Europe. That was the problems that they were having. And so what a gold standard does is it puts a discipline on the ability of a central bank to print money. Because if the United States prints a bunch of money and we have a gold standard, all a gold standard means is that anybody that holds a U.S. dollar has the right to convert it to gold. Well, even though we were off the gold standard internally, the world stayed on the gold standard until August 1st, 1972, when Nixon took us off. Why did he take us off? Because between the expenditures of the Great Society and the expenditures of the Vietnam War, the world realized we were printing money. The world was taking their dollars, which we flooded the world with. They were taking them to the Treasury and say, give me gold. They did some forecasts and they said, wow, we're running out of gold. So Nixon gave his famous executive order and took us off the international balance of payments with respect to gold on that day. And when he did that, the dollar floated. Well, since at least, I'll have to look up the exact number, but at least 50% of the world's governments back then pegged their currency to the dollar. Meaning if the dollar goes up, they have to make theirs go up. So if we have inflation, they have to have inflation. That's why China's inflation rate's so bad, because they've, for different reasons, they've historically pegged to the dollar. And that's kind of what is going on in that type of thing. And then when you have expected inflation type variables here, because I think last time I was on, I was talking about stagflation and the how reminiscent to me are the leading indicators of things that we use to measure these things from the middle 70s. And guess what is a great thing to buy if you expect stagflation? A house. So the gold standard provides discipline because there's a limited amount of gold in the world. There's not a limit to how much electronic money the Federal Reserve can print. But every dollar it prints, every pencil it buys, it dilutes the value of the dollar internationally. Now, if other countries dilute their currency to the same rough proportions as we do, then it's kind of a wash, right? It's just everybody has some inflation. But usually what happens in these things, the nightmare scenario for economists is there's a big exogenous event. Let's say there's a limited nuclear war and two big U.S. cities get completely blown away. Let's say there's a massive national disaster that requires another round of massive expenditures. Or let's say we have an enemy that has a concerted plan to crash the dollar. I wonder who that could be. And the way they would do that is they just hoard dollars, and they don't really have a choice if they want to keep their currency up. So they just keep buying dollars, and then when they're ready, they dump them on the open market. Now, when you dump anything on an open market, what happens? The price drops, right? So that's the fear that we have moving forward. And the Fed has decided, whether you agree with it or not, that long-term interest rates need to be very, very low. They're basically 0%. Anyone that's not buying a house right now is nuts. Unless they are just so mobile and, carefree in their life, they just don't want the hassle of it. But assuming that they have any investment, real estate right now is a great investment to have, because real estate is like gold. It's real. You can go touch it. You can live in it. It's not Bitcoin. It's not electronically printed money. It's a tangible asset. And that's the sort of things that tend to appreciate. That's why little $90,000 shacks can be bid up over twice their price in a year. And I'm actually worried right now about the United States. There's a limit to how much we can print. And if you go back to the debates on the Federal Reserve, the conservatives of that time argued that this would build a bloated federal government that would be imperialist. And some people would argue that happened.
That's what happened. That is exactly what has happened. Mark, thank you for that overview. We've got to close it here, and we're taking calls on the other side of the break. I want to make sure we have enough time to take calls in case anybody has comments, questions, that kind of thing. But thank you for the conversation. Great conversation.
Thank you.
And for those listening, that was Mark Frost. He's an entrepreneur, economist, professor, consultant, drummer, Eagle Scout, Marine, a capitalist, a Joseph Schumpeterian, and a recovering libertarian. And you're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We are going into a break. We'll be back in a minute taking your calls, 202-521-1320. Be back on the other side of this short break.
Fault Lines. We are talking
24 hours a day, 7 days a week.
You are listening.
We give you the most essential out of the endless information space.
Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
Peer into the future with Political Misfits on Thursdays when we analyze the latest trends in news, politics, and culture. Catch us on 105.5 in Washington, D.C., or 102.9 or 104.7 in Kansas City. Achtung, baby.
Fault Lines.
And we are back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. And we are in our rap segment for today's show. 202-521-1320 is the number. We have Tarif calling in from New Orleans. Tarif, you're on the line. What's on your mind? Tarif? maybe he's muted. Maybe he's absent. I'll give you one more try. Tarif, you there? And I can't hear him, which means I'm moving on. I'm sorry, Tarif. Feel free to call back in. We have Ro calling from California. Oh, and we're taking your calls, 202-521-1320. Ro, you're on the line. What's on your mind?
Hello?
Hi. Hey, Ro, you're on.
Oh, okay. So I just wanted to comment on what I think are your guys' shameful Santorum conversations. So one, Jamarl reaffirms Santorum's ignorant comments, saying he's not wrong. We wipe them out. And Shane, as usual, when it comes to present racial or settler colonial violence in the U.S., deflects to media matters, concluding that pushback by indigenous peoples is grasping at straws. So, quote-unquote, American culture doesn't exist without stolen indigenous land, culture, identity, infrastructure, or food. And I just think that this commentary is not smart, but like Santorum, ignorant at history, and simply reproduces indigenous erasure while you guys enjoy living on Lakota and Piscataway lands. Finally, and despite Jamarl's attempt to both deny confirm indigenous genocide, indigenous people have survived genocide and ethnic cleansing because they resist, or what Shane calls grasping at straws. So I would recommend that you invite an indigenous representative who has commented on this.
We do. Yeah, we have an invitation out. We have an invitation out to Jen Deerenwater.
Yeah.
We had on, I believe, back in November to talk about exactly this issue. I disagree. I literally didn't bring up media matters during that, and I think that we both recognize that there was a genocide. As interestingly enough, so did Rick Santorum. But I don't, Ro. When Rick Santorum says, his comments can be seen if he used slightly different words that I don't think actually change the content of his speech. He can himself be seen to have said that indigenous culture has been erased, that Native American culture specifically has been eradicated, and that there is little left of it in current American culture. Where do you disagree with that, or where do you think that we were unfair there?
She's out.
She left.
Why did you get off the phone? That's a good conversation.
Bro, come on. Yeah, that would have been an interesting.
You can't run away from that, bro.
Look, you said a bunch of stuff, and we disagree with it, and we should have a conversation about it. Don't just say it.
Because that's
your
basically
life is your life.
Look, my grandfather, like I've said it on more than one occasion, is Native American. He is Cherokee. And I have Native Americans strong throughout my family on both sides. So this is not a rah-rah Rick Santorum. I think the point that I'm trying to make here is Rick Santorum is basically arguing that that culture was eradicated. And on some level, you can make a case that says, well, yeah, there's traditions of Native Americans that withstand. You have the reservations that are honestly shameful pens, there's like just open air ghettos that put Native Americans into. But I think the key point is that we committed a genocide. And the very point of the genocide is that it's an eradication and an erasure. And so this is not a rah-rah that it took place. This is clear acknowledgement that it took place, and that all of this is basically built on the ashes of other civilizations. I've said that even in the last video that I did on Santorum. I guess the point that we're making here is Santorum doesn't defend what I honestly do believe is right, that we eradicated Native Americans. And that because of such, that the history of them, in many respects, had been erased. I don't necessarily think that's a indefensible comment, even though I know what it's saying is monstrous. I mean, we're talking about the eradication of human beings, right? So I get it. God, I wish you would have stayed on the phone, because that would have been an interesting conversation, because I don't think there's this massive disagreement in the way that it's being said. But
I agree. It would have been an interesting conversation. We got other callers. Ro, thank you for the call. We have Brave calling in from Atlanta. Brave, you're on. What's on your mind?
Hey guys, I just want to say thank you for having Frost on to talk about the housing situation. In the beginning, his as he was going into it in the first portion of the segment, his take on it as far as what was causing it post COVID. I believe that's it's slightly correct. I just think it's kind of superficial. I think the second portion of the segment where he actually started getting into the value of the dollar, really whether he intended to or not, really hones in. That's obviously he get into it.
Yeah, that was fascinating. I was sitting here as a spectator listening to that, Brave. I was like, "Whoa, keep going. That's interesting. Keep going."
Yeah, exactly. Because even Grant Cardone, a lot of investors come out, a lot of wealthier investors who talk about the market as it is right now have come out and said pretty much the same thing, that wealthier people see the cash as, to quote Grant Cardone, cash is trash. And so what they're doing is they're dumping their cash and buying real estate assets, not to like move. And this is the part that separates it from his from Frost's first segment comments on it. Not to move in. It's not about people trying to. It's not about like white flight or people trying to buy and move further out because they want to work remote and live in a nice neighborhood. It's more about wealthier people who have like all this excess cash, knowing that the value of that cash is going to drop, or expecting that value of that cash to drop. And so they're just buying up real estate, investment firms and all. It's buying.
Absolutely. Institutional investors. And that was left out of that first conversation. I thought he made a very interesting point about, from the sort of more individual oriented perspective, from individual families or people looking to move. I thought that was a valid point.
Yeah.
But you're also right.
Yeah. I don't think that's shallow. I think that's fair game. I mean, if you think of COVID, and you think of like how dramatic the consequences were. I mean, we've been working from home for like a year now. And on top of working from home for a year, think about that all throughout your particular society, maybe even your world. And how many of those companies start saying, hey, maybe we don't need a company. Maybe we don't need a building. Maybe we don't need, meaning it like, I think I think it's fair to say that the relationship between individuals and work changed. Where, people start working from home more. I mean, my wife, she's never going into an office again. We are forcibly, Shane not so much, from going into the office. And I'm joking when I'm saying forcibly. But we're going to the office. But you have a lot of other people who are not. I mean, is that not a fair point to make?
Well, I think it is, but I think he's also right. And I know, Greg. No, Brave. And I'm sorry for cutting off. I didn't even know if you're on, but I think that the point about institutional investors, cash, if you're trying to maintain or increase your wealth over time, if you got money and you want to use your money to make more money, cash is a depreciating asset because of inflation. So you're left with a couple of options. Do you buy an asset? Effectively, your option is buy an asset that is going to increase in value, whether that's the stock market, whether that's real estate, whether that's, physical assets like gold, for instance. There are only so many options that people can actually buy. And the stock market went down and then back up like crazy last year. It dropped dramatically in March. And then we saw I don't even know what it was, like a crazy increase. I remember seeing people talking about
it. Went to huge heights. I mean, like in regards to the stocks, and then it plummeted all of a sudden.
Yes.
And it's like the money has to go somewhere.
With mortgage rates as low as they are, whether you're a smaller investor who's looking to buy and renovate a property and lease it out, or whether you're an institutional investor that just wants to get your stake in the ground, those are both also super relevant. But I felt like the point he made was interesting. Brave, thank you for the call. Tarif is back, and I want to make sure we get him on. But I appreciate that. And you were also the one who brought this up, I believe, late last week when you called in and talked about this. I tried to give you credit. I think I mentioned you when we were talking with Mark. Anyway, we have Tarif calling in from New Orleans. Tarif, you're on the line. What is on your mind?
I have two quick comments before I get that free journal of science. There's something going on with the phone line. I don't know what it is. It just went dead. I don't know. Can y'all hear me?
Yeah. Yes.
So
we got only about 45 seconds, so I'd get to it.
All right. All right. Matthew Edward was talking about the UFOs, the truth behind them, with the research he done by looking into Norm Klein research on shock therapy and all that. That it'd be good for him to be on your show where he can discuss from a different point of view
what's his name? What's his name?
His name is Matthew Eric. He's Canadian. He have his own little blog, CanadianPatriot.com or .org. The Rising Tide Foundation. He's out of Canada, and he have a totally different view of what's going on with that.
Okay.
There's a totally different take on what's going on. I think he'd be going on the show, and it'll balance out the argument.
Interesting. Well. Tarif, thank you for the recommendation. Always appreciate that. Thank you for calling in. Glad we were able to get you on. We got to close today's show out, folks. Quick note, Jamarl will be on this Friday. I'm taking the day off because I'm moving cross country back to D.C. to prepare to go back into the studio on Monday. Just getting that out of the way. Some folks, I'm sure, will be celebrating my absence. Anyway, we need to close out today's show. We will be back tomorrow morning at 7 a.m. Eastern. I want to thank Jamarl, my co-host, all of our guests, all of our callers, our engineer, Andre, our producer, Cordell. I want to close today's show out. See you again tomorrow morning. Have a great day.
Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Another one is in the record books. Guys, I want to thank all of you for joining us. Interesting show. Mark's explanation was fantastic. I was sitting there listening. I didn't want to intervene because he was doing good with the explanation, getting into the creation of money, the reserve, all that stuff. I love that. The history of this stuff. Like, and he's right. The pound was the standard at one point. Britain, a brittle empire after the First War. Well, Britain was in dire straits. I mean, they were at the point where they owned, like 50% of the world. By the same token, they had extricated themselves from a war that they won. But Jesus Christ, the price of winning. And then for like 20 years later, end up in another world war that ends up being worse than the First World War. Yeah, they were a broken empire. The only person that was standing at that point was the United States. It wasn't so much that we were exceptional, either in the war, but we were phenomenal in regards to our ability to get supplies, our industry, all of those things. The Soviet Union basically, you could say, won the war in Stalingrad and Kursk and those campaigns. By the same token, the supplies, the materials, the military, all of that stuff from the United States did help. But I guess the point that I'm trying to make, when those things were at the end of that process, we weren't bombed like talking about. And so I love the fact that Mark gets into the history of how this stuff was organized and whatnot. Phenomenal. Really good conversation. Stephen Bassett. I am dreading the conversation that is going to have to take place with Stephen Bassett later today, because that was an unfortunate conversation. If you are building, let's say, an argument, and you start off with certain building blocks of that argument, let's say like a Lou Elizondo. Well, Elizondo, being in the background and being the guy investigating this stuff, and comes out and has an interview on the show, and he says several things in that interview about materials, about things that we have seen, things that we have contact with, and at no point was he talking about an interdimensional being. He was talking about technology. Logically, if he's talking to technology, it's either us or it's not us. Elizondo is not coming with the argument that it's us, because he's arguing that the technology that he found predates our ability to do any of these things. Meaning, you can make a case that says, okay, some of the ships that might be us, By the same token, the moment that you have technology that didn't come from us, well, that goes out the window. Either he's lying or he's not. And I don't necessarily accept that he's bald-faced lying. And so I don't necessarily need to make an argument each time about what's in it. Whether it's being controlled by something or whether it's something's in it, less relevant to me. If it's not us and it's not on this planet, then it's something else. So I don't necessarily need Bassett to come here and make this argument defending that point. Bassett is on the show to have a conversation about the IG report or the IG investigating or doing the inquiry, or having the conversation about what is expected in the report. And I know Bassett has somewhat of a long form way of getting around to that. But he has been a lobbyist for what? For decades at this point. And on top of being a lobbyist, the guy's been an investigator and a journalist for 20-something years. So from the standpoint of his experience is intact. And there can be caveats around, I don't entirely buy into that, but etc. And you kind of move on. But yeah, Bassett wasn't on for that. So that is going to be an awkward conversation with Bassett to explain to him that he wasn't sandbagged, that he wasn't set up, that it wasn't anything crazy like that. That's unfortunate. The Bassett conversation was unfortunate. And honestly, at this point, those conversations may just be singular. The first conversation with Peter Oliver is always good. Affable, and he knows his stuff. And so I always like it when Peter Oliver comes on. It was an interesting show. Tomorrow is setting it up. We have Rick. I know at the very least we have Professor Richard Wolff. He will be on tomorrow. Friday has not been set up yet. And Friday is going to be solo. And so I'll probably start playing that today. But you guys are going to see me later today. I'm going to be doing shows over the course of the day. And so I'm going to say like, I'm going to say share. The next show is probably going to be chess, just to clear the palate. But other than that, you guys will see me later today. So I'm going to say like, I'm going to say share, and I'm going to say subscribe. Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.